In the early winter of 1952, a young woman stood on a wooden platform in the branches of a giant fig tree in Kenya, watching the African bush move beneath her in the dark. At that precise moment, thousands of miles away in the cold of an English night, her father died, and the weight of 1,000 years of history descended upon her shoulders. She had gone up the ladder a princess, she came down a queen. For the next 70 years, Elizabeth II would serve as the anchor of nations, a fixed point of alert composure in a world that remade itself radically and relentlessly around her. She would navigate the end of an empire, the dawn of the television age, the cold calculations of the Cold War, and the intimate, often painful unraveling of her own family's private lives. Through it all, she maintained a discipline of silence and a commitment to duty that made her not just a head of state, but a global icon of continuity. This is the story of that service, from the sun-bleached limestone of Malta to the quiet hills of Balmoral, and the woman who held an idea together when everything else seemed to be falling apart. Chapter 1: The Accidental Heir, From Bruton Street to the Throne, 1926 to 1936. London, in the small hours of April 21, 1926, was a city still wrapped in the deep quiet of night. The gas lamps along Bruton Street in Mayfair cast their amber glow upon wet cobblestones, and the world beyond the grand townhouse at number 17 moved slowly, unhurried, unknowing. Inside, behind walls of Georgian brick and tall sash windows, a birth was taking place, one that would in time reshape the destiny of an empire. At precisely 20 minutes to 3 in the morning, a child entered the world. She arrived not easily, but deliberately, brought into being through the careful hands of physicians in a room that smelled of linen and lamplight. The house belonged to Claude Bowes-Lyon, the Earl of Strathmore, the maternal grandfather of the newborn, and it was here, in this elegant Mayfair residence, that the first cries of Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary were heard. 3 names, each chosen with intention. 3 names for a girl who at that moment stood third in the long and winding line of succession to the British throne. Her father was Albert Frederick Arthur George, known to his family simply as Bertie, the Duke of York, second son of the reigning King George V. Her mother was Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon, a woman of warmth and quiet steel, who had already endeared herself to the British public with a grace that seemed entirely natural and entirely unforced. Together, they made a couple that the country found easy to love. Not grand, not remote, but present, warm and human. And now they had a daughter. In the nursery of Bruton Street, in the hours after her birth, the infant princess slept beneath blankets of the finest wool, her face round and flushed with the newness of existence. She was, by every measure, a child of privilege. But she was not, as yet, a child of destiny. The throne stood 2 figures away, first her uncle Edward, the Prince of Wales, that golden and beloved heir who charmed crowds wherever he went, and then her own father Bertie, quiet and earnest and dutiful. For little Elizabeth, the expectation was something far simpler: a life of royal comfort, of public appearances and private pleasures, of growing up in the long soft shadow of a monarchy that had endured for centuries. The newspapers took notice almost immediately. Royal births were events of national significance, and the cameras, those patient and intrusive instruments of the modern age, were trained upon the Yorks with great interest. Within just a few years, the child's face would grace the cover of Time magazine, not because she was the heir, but because she was already, somehow, captivating. There was something in the steadiness of her gaze, even as an infant, that seemed to suggest a quality beyond her years. But that was for the public world. In the private one, Elizabeth's early life was shaped by intimacy and routine. Her mother was a guiding presence, deeply involved in the education and formation of her eldest daughter's character. A governess arrived in due course, a Scottish woman named Marion Crawford, known fondly and forever afterward as Crawfie, and it was she who would oversee the young princess's daily lessons in the years that followed. History, literature, language, and music formed the pillars of Elizabeth's education. There was no Eton, no Roedean, no schoolroom shared with the daughters of earls and commoners. Instead, there were quiet mornings at a table in a well-appointed room, a patient teacher, and a child with a remarkable capacity for concentration. Elizabeth absorbed her lessons with a seriousness that seemed to come naturally to her. She did not chafe against the structure of her days. She found pleasure in order, in the stables especially, where she first discovered her abiding love for horses, and in the gardens where she and her governess would walk in the late afternoons when the lessons were done. She was by all accounts a contained and contented child. Not cold, never cold, but calm in a way that some children simply are, as though they carry within them some interior compass that never quite loses its bearing. Then came the year 1930, and with it a sister. Princess Margaret Rose arrived on the 4th of August, born at Glamis Castle in Scotland, the ancestral home of the Beausoleil family, where the stone walls were ancient and the moors stretched away in every direction. Margaret was from the very beginning everything her sister was not: vivid where Elizabeth was composed, impulsive where she was measured, the kind of child who filled a room with sound and color and unpredictable delight. Between them a bond formed that would last a lifetime, the particular closeness of sisters who understand each other in the way that only siblings can, through shared memory, shared space, shared blood. Their father, the Duke of York, was a man who felt things deeply and expressed them quietly. He had struggled with the debilitating stammer since childhood, a condition that made public life an act of constant courage, and he had turned his private world, his wife, his daughters, into the source of his greatest joy. He called them with characteristic simplicity and warmth, "we four." The phrase captured something essential about the family he and his wife had made, a unit unto itself, bounded by affection and mutual understanding, needing little from the wider world to feel whole. In 1932, this family of four settled into a new home. Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park became their country retreat, a rambling rose-colored house set among ancient trees and rolling grounds that Elizabeth would come to love with a depth that never diminished. Here, far from the formal corridors of Buckingham Palace and the watchful gaze of the court, the young princess grew up with mud on her boots and the smell of horses on her coat. She learned the rhythms of the English countryside, its seasons and its silences. She planted her own small garden plot, she rode her ponies through the parkland, and she came to understand, in the way that only comes from sustained exposure to living, growing things, that there is steadiness in the natural world that the human world can never quite replicate. These were, in many senses, golden years. Uncomplicated. Held in amber. But the world outside the gates of Royal Lodge was stirring, and not gently. King George V, the patriarch, the steady center of the monarchy's public identity, was aging. The man who had guided the royal family through a world war and the turbulent decades that followed was now diminished by illness, his voice once so commanding now a murmur. He had concerns about the future. He spoke of them rarely in public, but those who moved in his inner circle knew that his eldest son Edward troubled him greatly. The Prince of Wales was brilliant and restless, a man who wore his charm like a second skin but who seemed resistant to the weight of what his position required. The king, it was said, sometimes looked at his granddaughter Elizabeth with a quiet particular hope. He called her Lilibet, the name she had given herself in the early attempts of childhood, and there were those who believed he saw in her something that he did not entirely see in his own son. On the 20th of January 1936, King George V died at Sandringham, in the house he had loved in the Norfolk darkness. He was 70 years old. The nation mourned him deeply. He had been a constant, a man who had represented, through all the chaos of the early 20th century, something enduring and reliable in the institution of the crown. His eldest son ascended the throne as King Edward VIII. Edward was 51 years old, unmarried and adored. The world watched him with tremendous expectation. He was modern, charismatic, and possessed of a restless energy that some found invigorating and others quietly alarming. But the truth of Edward's reign would not be written in the language of public triumph. It would be written in something far more private and far more seismic. His name was known to everyone, but the name that would define his reign was a woman's. Wallis Simpson. An American divorcee, twice married, sophisticated and sharp-tongued, she had captured the king's heart so completely that he was willing in the end to place it above everything else. The Prime Minister opposed the match. The Church of England, which the king himself led as supreme governor, would not sanction a marriage to a divorced woman whose former husband still lived. The governments of the dominions were consulted, and their answer was the same. Edward could not have both the throne and Wallis Simpson. He chose Wallis Simpson. On the 11th of December 1936, Edward VIII broadcast his abdication to the nation on the radio, that strange and intimate medium that brought voices directly into the homes of ordinary people. His words were quiet and measured, the speech of a man who had rehearsed his reasons until they sat smoothly, however painfully, in his mouth. He spoke of his inability to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and discharge his duties as king without the help and support of the woman he loved. And then he stepped away from the throne, from the country, from the life that history had assigned him, and became in a matter of hours the Duke of Windsor. In the house at Royal Lodge, a 10-year-old girl listened. We do not know with certainty the precise words exchanged within that family that night, or in the days that followed. But we can imagine, and history gives us enough to construct the scene, the particular quality of the silence that must have descended upon we four. Because everything had changed. The comfortable distance that had stood between little Elizabeth and the crown, that comfortable buffer of 2 lives lived ahead of hers in the line of succession, had collapsed entirely. Her father was now the king. Albert Frederick Arthur George, the man who had fought his stammer in speech therapy sessions with a courage he rarely advertised, the man who had wanted nothing more than his roses and his family and a life of private duty. That man was now George VI, King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Emperor of India, head of an empire that spanned a quarter of the earth's surface. And his eldest daughter, Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, 10 years old and standing in the parlor of a pink house in Windsor Great Park, was now the heir presumptive. The designation was precise and legalistic, but its meaning was vast. Heir presumptive, not heir apparent because a future son, should one arrive, would supersede her, but presumptive nonetheless. For all practical purposes, she was now the one who would, in all probability, one day wear the crown. The lessons would change. The expectations would change. The weight that had rested invisibly somewhere in the distant future had moved measurably closer. Marion Crawford, the governess, later recalled that when Elizabeth was told of what her uncle's abdication would mean for her father, and therefore for herself, the princess turned to her quietly and asked a single question. She asked whether it meant that her father would now be king. And when the answer came, yes, it did mean that, she said nothing for a long moment. Then she nodded. And she went to find her father. What passed between them in those private minutes, no record has preserved. Perhaps nothing of great eloquence was said. Perhaps they simply stood together in the way that fathers and daughters sometimes do, in the acknowledgement of something too large for words. What we know is that George VI was a man who cried with a readiness that he was never entirely comfortable with, a man of genuine feeling, and that Elizabeth, even at 10, possessed a quality of composure that those around her found both reassuring and faintly remarkable. The children of Britain had been given fairy tales, in which princesses waited for their lives to begin. Here was a princess for whom life in its fullest and most consequential sense had just arrived, not through any wish of her own, not through any act of ambition, but through the choices of others, through the irresistible currents of history, through the abdication of a king who loved a woman more than he loved a throne. The history books would be amended. The tutors would arrive with new materials. Sir Henry Martin, Vice Provost of Eton College, would be engaged to teach the young princess constitutional history, the laws and precedents and conventions upon which the monarchy rested, the architecture of governance that she would one day be required to understand with the confidence and clarity of a sovereign. And somewhere, in the careful accumulation of days and lessons and quiet mornings in the schoolroom at Royal Lodge, the transformation had begun. Not a transformation of character. Elizabeth was and would always remain recognizably herself. But a transformation of purpose, of trajectory, of what it would mean in the fullness of time to be Elizabeth. The accidental heir was learning to become the necessary queen. Chapter 2, Duty in the Blitz, Adolescence and Service, 1937 to 1947. The coronation of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth took place on the 12th of May, 1937, in Westminster Abbey, beneath the same ancient vaulted ceilings that had witnessed the crowning of English monarchs for nearly 1,000 years. The ceremony was long and grave and magnificent. The 11-year-old Princess Elizabeth sat in the royal gallery and watched her father receive the crown, that heavy, jeweled thing, and understood, perhaps for the first time in its fullest dimension, what it meant to carry it. She kept a diary of the day. Her account was careful and observant, recording the details with a precision that spoke of someone who was already learning how to remember, how to witness, how to hold events in the mind with the steadiness of a person who knows that history is not merely something that happens, it is something that must be tended. The world that surrounded the newly crowned family was not, however, a world inclined toward ceremony and continuity for long. Beyond the gold and the velvet and the ancient words of the coronation oath, Europe was moving. It was moving in the particular way that precedes catastrophe, not with a single dramatic gesture, but with a slow, grinding shift, as though the ground beneath the continent's feet were beginning to tilt. Adolf Hitler had remilitarized the Rhineland the previous year. He had absorbed Austria. The Munich Agreement of 1938 would buy, as its architect Neville Chamberlain believed, peace, but it bought only time, and not very much of it. On the 3rd of September 1939, Great Britain declared war on Germany. Elizabeth was 13 years old. The question of where the princesses should spend the war was not, in the beginning, entirely settled. There were those who suggested Canada, a safe distance from the bombs that everyone knew would come, a continuation of royal life in the vast peaceable spaces of the Dominion. Queen Elizabeth, their mother, dismissed the idea with the kind of quiet finality that made argument feel slightly absurd. The children would not go to Canada. The Queen would not go to Canada. And the King, naturally, would not leave London. They would remain. They would be seen. The monarchy, above all things, must be present. The princesses were moved to Windsor Castle. It was not, technically, the safest place in England. The castle sat in the Thames Valley, not unreachably far from the German bombers that would come night after night to pound the cities below, but it was defensible, it was vast, and it was, in its ancient stones and its deep cellars, a place of extraordinary solidity. Elizabeth and Margaret lived there through the most violent years of the war, in rooms that were cold in winter, and that hummed with the particular atmosphere of a great building holding its breath. The Blitz began in September of 1940, and for 57 consecutive nights, German aircraft crossed the Channel and dropped their cargo upon London. The East End burned. Coventry was devastated. Portsmouth, Plymouth, Southampton, Birmingham, Glasgow, city after city absorbed the shock of destruction and somehow held. The people in the shelters, in the underground stations, in the basements of terraced houses, pulled their coats around themselves and waited for the all-clear. At Windsor, the princesses could hear the distant percussion of it on bad nights, the low, continuous rumble from the south and east that was the sound of a city being remade by violence. Elizabeth lay in the dark and listened, and one imagines that even then, in those listening hours, something in her was being formed, some layer of character that only adversity of this particular kind can produce. Not hardness. Something more useful than hardness. Endurance. Patience. The understanding that the worst things can be outlasted, that morning comes even after the longest night. It was in October of 1940 that she first spoke to the nation. The BBC had a program called Children's Hour, a gentle, reassuring broadcast directed at the youngest members of the listening audience, and during the war it had taken on a particular poignancy, because so many of the children it addressed were evacuees. Children who had been gathered up from the cities and sent to the countryside, to the homes of strangers, to villages whose names they had never heard and whose accents were foreign to their ears. Children who slept in unfamiliar beds and missed their mothers with an ache that no bravery could entirely suppress. Elizabeth was 14. She sat before a microphone and she spoke. Her voice was clear and steady, with the careful diction of a girl who had been taught to speak well but who had, even then, something beyond training in her delivery. A quality of genuine warmth that no amount of elocution lessons can manufacture. She spoke to the evacuated children directly, acknowledging their separation from their homes and their families. She told them that she and Margaret knew what it meant to be kept from the people they loved. She said that the children of Britain, all of them, were bearing a share of the national burden, and that they were bearing it bravely, and that she saluted them for it. It was a short broadcast, but the effect of it was not small. Here was the heir to the throne, a child herself, reaching across the airwaves to acknowledge the experience of other children. There was no condescension in it, no performance of benevolent superiority. It was direct and sincere, and it was understood as such by the families who gathered around their wireless sets and listened. A member of the royal family had spoken to ordinary people, as though their suffering was real, and their courage was worthy of recognition. This was not, in 1940, something to be taken for granted. The war continued. Elizabeth grew. She moved through the years of the conflict in the way that all young people move through extraordinary times, absorbing it, being shaped by it, while simultaneously continuing to become. She read voraciously. She took her confirmation in the Church of England in 1941, a rite of passage that carried for her a spiritual weight that was not merely ceremonial. She was a person of genuine faith, and she had been so since childhood. She continued her writing. She organized theatrical performances at Windsor with Margaret, Christmas pantomimes, light-hearted and deliberately absurd, in which the two princesses performed for an audience of castle staff and military personnel, injecting into the long gray wartime winters a few hours of laughter. But as the years passed, Elizabeth's desire for something more, something active, something that would constitute real service rather than symbolic presence, grew stronger and harder to ignore. She watched the young men of Britain go to war. She watched the women too, in the factories, in the fields, in the uniformed services that the state had created to harness the energies of the female population. The Auxiliary Territorial Service, known as the ATS, was the women's branch of the British Army. Its members drove ambulances, operated anti-aircraft batteries, worked as mechanics and radio operators and cooks and clerks. They wore khaki. They got their hands dirty. They were indispensable. Elizabeth wanted to be among them. Her father was reluctant. The king understood better than almost anyone the symbolic value of his daughter, and he also understood the anxiety that would be generated among the public and the government should the heir presumptive be placed in anything that resembled actual danger. But Elizabeth pressed, with the quiet insistence of someone who has learned that persistence, applied without drama, is more effective than argument. And in February of 1945, with the war in Europe lurching toward its conclusion, the king relented. She joined No. 1 Mechanical Transport Training Center of the ATS at Aldershot. She was given the rank of honorary second subaltern, equivalent to a second lieutenant, and she underwent the same training in the same conditions as the other women in her unit. She learned to drive military vehicles, heavy lorries and staff cars and ambulances. She learned to read maps under pressure. And she learned more practically to take apart and reassemble an engine, to understand the mechanical language of the machines upon which armies moved and hospitals ran. The photographs from this period are remarkable, and their power has not diminished with time. There is the princess of the blood, the heir presumptive, the future Queen of England, and she is in overalls. Her face is smudged. Her hands, those carefully tended royal hands, are engaged with the honest, unromantic work of machinery. She is not performing. She is not posing in overalls for the benefit of a camera while someone else does the actual work beside her. She drove the vehicles herself. She changed the tires herself. She inspected the engines with the same attention to detail that she would later bring to the reading of her government's state papers. The image of Princess Elizabeth in her ATS uniform, sleeves rolled to the elbow, surrounded by the mechanical components of a military vehicle, entered the public consciousness and stayed there. It was a symbol of extraordinary simplicity and extraordinary power. Here was the monarchy, not merely presiding over national sacrifice, but participating in it. Here was a future queen who understood, in her hands and in her muscles and in the fatigue at the end of a training day, what her people were experiencing. The distance between the palace and the people, that old, troublesome, occasionally treacherous distance, was visibly, palpably reduced. The war in Europe ended on the 8th of May, 1945. Day. Victory in Europe. London erupted in a joy so long suppressed that it came out almost as delirium. The crowds gathered spontaneously, as crowds do when something too large to contain drives them into the streets. They surged toward Buckingham Palace. The king and queen and the two princesses appeared on the balcony, again and again, as the evening deepened into night, and the bonfires were lit across the capital. The people below roared their relief and their gratitude, and their exhausted, incredulous happiness. And on that night, that extraordinary, unrepeatable night, something unusual happened. The king gave permission for Elizabeth and Margaret to go out. Not in the formal sense, not in the sense of a royal engagement with motorcades and equerries and crowds held back by barriers. He allowed them to go out anonymously, into the streets, among the people. They dressed in plain clothes, pulled their caps down, and slipped into the throng. They linked arms with strangers. They sang. They moved through the celebrating city, as though they were any two young women in their late teens and early 20s, experiencing the end of a war that had shaped every day of their adolescence. Elizabeth remembered this night for the rest of her life. She spoke of it on occasion, with a quality that one might almost call reverence for the sheer unguarded humanness of it. The anonymity. The freedom. The roaring living mass of ordinary people, undignified and magnificent in equal measure. It was perhaps one of the only nights of her life when she was, outwardly at least, simply herself, not a symbol, not an heir, not a figure upon whom the hopes of a nation rested. Just a young woman in a crowd, celebrating the end of something terrible, and the beginning of something unknown. The post-war world assembled itself slowly, painfully from the rubble. Britain was exhausted and indebted, and diminished in the physical sense, even as its moral standing, the standing of a nation that had refused in its darkest hour to surrender, had never been higher. The empire was beginning in its various parts to stir toward independence. The old certainties were dissolving. But within all of this, within the national reconstruction of identity and purpose, there was a personal story developing as well. A story that had begun in its earliest chapters long before the war. Elizabeth had first met Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark in 1934, when she was 8 years old and he was 13, at the wedding of his cousin Marina to Prince George, Duke of Kent. He was a tall, fair-haired boy of striking looks and considerable self-possession, the son of Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, a great-great-grandson of Queen Victoria, a prince who had spent most of his life in peripatetic exile following his family's expulsion from Greece in 1922. He had been educated at Gordonston in Scotland, and then at the Royal Naval College, Dartmouth, where the paths of Philip and Elizabeth crossed again in the summer of 1939. Elizabeth was 13. Philip was 18. He was assigned by the captain of the college to look after the two princesses during a visit that circumstances had curtailed. There was a mumps outbreak among the cadets, and the royal party was largely confined to the captain's house, away from the main buildings. Philip spent the day with them. He was, by all accounts, vivid company, energetic, slightly reckless, possessed of the kind of easy confidence that comes naturally to certain people and is entirely unteachable in others. He jumped over a tennis net. He ate a conspicuous quantity of shrimp and biscuits. Marion Crawford, observing the young princess throughout the day, noticed something. Elizabeth, she later wrote, could hardly take her eyes off him. It was perhaps the beginning of what would become the central personal attachment of her life. Or perhaps it was only the admiration of a 13-year-old girl for a young man 5 years her senior, handsome and self-assured and possessed of a freedom of movement that her own position did not permit. Either way, the day at Dartmouth planted something. A correspondence began. Letters were exchanged through the years of the war, Philip serving in the Royal Navy and distinguishing himself in the Pacific, Elizabeth reading his dispatches from the great distances of a global conflict. By the time the war was over, the correspondence had become something else. The letters were warmer, more frequent, more particular in the way that only letters between people who have decided to mean something to each other can be. Philip visited Windsor. He was invited to Balmoral. The king observed the relationship with the father's cautious watchfulness. He was not, initially, in a hurry to give his daughter away. And there were those at court who had reservations about Philip's foreign origins, his lack of a settled nationality, the somewhat peripatetic quality of his background. Philip renounced his Greek and Danish royal titles. He was naturalized as a British subject, taking the surname Mountbatten from his mother's family. He converted formally to the Church of England. The engagement was announced on the 9th of July, 1947, to a nation in need of celebration. Britain was still living under rationing. The austerity of the war years had not simply dissolved with the peace, and the prospect of a royal wedding was greeted with the particular hunger of a people who have been too long without ceremony, without pageantry, without the gorgeous irrational excess of public joy. Women from across the country sent their clothing coupons to the palace, so that Elizabeth might have extra fabric for her dress. The gesture was touching and impractical. The coupons from members of the public could not be accepted, but it spoke to something genuine in the national feeling. People wanted to give. They wanted to participate, even from a distance, in something beautiful. On the eve of the wedding, Philip was created Duke of Edinburgh and granted the style of His Royal Highness. He had given up much, his nationality, his name, his independence, to step into the life that marriage to Elizabeth would require. In return, he gained a wife of remarkable character, and a purpose that would in time reveal itself in the complex and sometimes difficult role of the prince consort. A man of considerable ability and will, finding his place beside a woman whose position would always, by the nature of things, exceed his own. The 20th of November 1947 was a cold and grey morning in London. But the crowds that lined the route from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey were enormous, and they were warm in the way that crowds gathered in common feeling are always warm, bodies pressed together, breath rising in small clouds in the November air, faces turned in one direction, toward the procession that was making its way through streets that had not long ago been patrolled under blackout conditions. Inside the Abbey, beneath its soaring arches, in a nave lined with the representatives of nations and the dignitaries of an empire, Elizabeth walked toward the altar. Her dress, designed by Norman Hartnell, was a creation of ivory Duchess satin and tulle, embroidered with 10,000 seed pearls and crystals in patterns drawn from Botticelli's Primavera, flowers and wheat and orange blossom worked in silver thread. The train was 15 feet long. She wore the fringed tiara, a piece from the Queen's own collection, which snapped and had to be hastily repaired by a jeweler moments before she left the palace, adding a small, very human crisis to the morning's otherwise ceremonial perfection. She walked the long aisle. She said her vows. Her voice, as it always was when the occasion required it, was clear and steady and unhurried. And she married him. The decade that had begun with the weight of a crown descending unexpectedly upon her family, that decade of war and service and growing up in the particular accelerated fashion that extraordinary circumstances demand, closed with this: a woman of 21, standing at the beginning of her marriage, at the beginning of the next chapter of a life that was already, by any measure, singular. She was not yet queen. That lay ahead, in a future that no one in November of 1947 could quite foresee the shape of. But she was ready. She had been made ready by everything that had preceded this moment, in ways that she perhaps could not entirely articulate, but that she felt, as deeply and as certainly as she felt anything. The doors of Westminster Abbey opened. The Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh stepped into the grey November light. And the crowd, vast and patient and cold and faithful, roared. Chapter 3, The Naval Wife, Malta in the Accession, 1948–1952. Chapter 3, The Naval Wife, Malta in the Accession, 1948–1952. There is a photograph from Malta, taken sometime in the early 1950s, in which Elizabeth is laughing. Not the composed, gracious smile of formal occasions, not the expression carefully calibrated to convey warmth without surrendering dignity, but a real laugh, unguarded and unposed, the kind that arrives before the mind has had a chance to intervene. She is in the sun. Her hair is loose. She looks in this image like a young woman who is exactly where she wants to be. It is one of the few such photographs that exist. The life that Elizabeth and Philip built in the years immediately following their wedding was, by the standards of what had come before and what would follow, something approaching ordinary, or at least as close to ordinary as the heir presumptive to the British throne could reasonably expect to come. Philip had returned to his naval career after the wedding, and it was his career that shaped the geography of their early marriage. He was a man who loved the sea, who had distinguished himself in the war, and who had every intention of continuing to distinguish himself in peacetime. He was not by temperament or by inclination a man who intended to spend his life at receptions and ribbon cuttings. The Navy was his profession, his passion, and, in those early years of marriage, the framework around which both their lives were organized. Their first child arrived in November of 1948. Charles Philip Arthur George was born at Buckingham Palace on the 14th of the month, in the same way that royal births had always taken place, attended by physicians and formality, announced to a nation that received the news with the particular pleasure of the accustomed. He was the first grandchild of the king and queen, and his grandfather George VI held him with the evident delight of a man who had been through a great deal and found in the warmth of new life something that restored him. The baby was healthy. The princess was well. London celebrated with the modest, rationed cheerfulness of a city still slowly unfastening itself from the austerity of wartime. But the arrival of Charles did not immediately reshape the pattern of Elizabeth's life in the way that it might have for any other young mother. The demands of her position, the appearances, the duties, the unrelenting calendar of a royal woman whose father was increasingly unable to carry the full burden of public life, pulled her in directions that motherhood alone could not determine. And Philip, within months of Charles's birth, received his appointment. He was posted to the Mediterranean, to the island of Malta, where the Royal Navy maintained a presence of considerable strategic importance. He was to serve as first lieutenant of HMS Checkers, and later commanding his own vessel HMS Magpie. Elizabeth followed him. The decision was not, of course, as simple as that sentence makes it sound. There were considerations and conversations, and the particular domestic negotiation that any young couple must conduct when the demands of career and family intersect. Charles, in the early months of his life, remained largely in England, in the care of his grandparents and the palace's considerable household, a circumstance that Elizabeth would, in later life, reflect upon with a complexity of feeling that she rarely made explicit, but that those around her occasionally glimpsed. She was a woman shaped by duty, and duty in those years required her to be other places than with her infant son. She bore this as she bore most things, without complaint, without visible anguish, with the forward-facing composure that was for her both instinct and discipline. But Malta itself was a revelation. The island in those years was small and sun-soaked and deeply marked by the war. It had endured some of the most ferocious aerial bombardment of the entire conflict, and the people who lived there carried their survival with a pride that was quiet and absolute. The streets of Valletta were limestone white and ancient, the harbors deep blue in the Mediterranean light. The naval community on the island was tight-knit in the way that all expatriate communities are, bound by shared circumstance, by distance from home, by the particular solidarity of people who understand each other's daily rhythms without needing to explain them. The wives of naval officers lived lives of genuine simplicity by the standards of peacetime aristocracy. There were no palaces, no staterooms, no ceremonial occasions requiring 6 months of preparation. There were dinner parties in modest houses, and shopping in the local market, and drives along the cliff roads above the sea. Elizabeth shopped. She went to the hairdresser. A visit to a local salon like any other woman in Malta, sitting beneath the dryer among strangers who might or might not know who she was. She attended dances at the Marsa Polo Club, and sat at tables with other naval wives, and talked about the uncomplicated subjects of daily life. She swam. She drove herself, without a retinue, through the island's narrow roads. She was, by every account from those who knew her in Malta, genuinely, contentedly happy. Philip commanded his ship. He was on the bridge of HMS Magpie in his element, decisive and technically gifted, and possessed of the competitive instinct that makes a naval officer effective. He took great pleasure in the work, and his young crew took pleasure in him. He was demanding and occasionally sharp-tempered but fair, and the men under his command, by all accounts, would have done almost anything for him. On the island, away from the complicated protocols of the palace, he and Elizabeth were simply themselves, a naval officer and his wife, navigating the domestic landscape of a naval posting, with the good humor and occasional friction of any young married couple learning the texture of each other's daily company. Princess Anne was born in August of 1950, at Clarence House in London. Elizabeth had returned from Malta for the birth, and the baby arrived, fair, healthy, immediately and obviously spirited in the way that would define her for the rest of her life. Philip came home briefly. And then the Mediterranean called them back, and they returned to the sun and the limestone and the blue harbor, and the 2 young children remained in England. But the Mediterranean idyll was already beginning to close at its edges. King George VI was unwell. He had been unwell for longer than the public knew, and longer perhaps than those in his closest circle had allowed themselves to fully acknowledge. He had smoked heavily all his adult life, with the characteristic disregard of his generation for the relationship between tobacco and the body's slow deterioration. By 1948, he had been diagnosed with arteriosclerosis. In 1949, his doctors discovered that he was suffering from a condition in his right leg that threatened circulation to the point where amputation had been a genuine possibility. A possibility managed ultimately by surgery that preserved the limb but underscored the seriousness of his condition. And then, in the autumn of 1951, the word that no physician wishes to bring to a patient's family arrived with the weight of a stone: lung cancer. The king underwent surgery to remove his left lung in September of that year. The country was told only that he had undergone a lung resection, a phrase calibrated to convey seriousness without conveying the full gravity of the diagnosis. But those who saw him in the months that followed understood. The king was diminished. The vibrant man who had accepted an unwanted crown and worn it with such steady, hard-won dignity was being consumed from within by something that all the dignity in the world could not arrest. Elizabeth came home from Malta. The posting, the naval life, the sunlit interlude, all of it gave way, as it always had to the reality of who she was and what was required of her. Philip relinquished the command of HMS Magpie. It was not stated explicitly as a permanent relinquishment at the time, but both of them understood with the quiet understanding of two intelligent people who do not require every truth to be spoken aloud, that his naval career, the career he loved, the life that had given him purpose and identity independent of his wife's position, was effectively over. He would never return to active service. He was 29 years old. Elizabeth stepped forward to cover the ground her father could no longer cover. In the autumn of 1951, she and Philip undertook a royal tour of Canada, a country of vast proportions and deep attachment to the crown, where they were received with an enthusiasm that spoke to something genuine in the relationship between the people and the monarchy. They crossed the country by train, stopping in city after city, greeting crowds that stood in the autumn cold for hours simply to see them pass. It was demanding work, the endless handshaking, the concentrated attention required for every engagement, the maintenance of energy and warmth across weeks of unrelenting public contact. From Canada, they crossed the border into the United States. In Washington, Elizabeth met Harry S. Truman, the plain-spoken Missourian, who had brought the war in the Pacific to its terrible conclusion with two weapons the world had never seen before, and who now presided over a nation of extraordinary power and uncertain responsibilities. He received the princess with the warmth of a man who appreciated directness, and she impressed him, as she impressed virtually everyone who engaged with her in those early public years, with her composure and her evident intelligence. Truman, who was not given to empty compliment, later remarked upon her qualities in terms that carried genuine admiration. She was, he said, a remarkable young woman. He was not wrong. The king had wanted to accompany his daughter to Canada. He had wanted it badly, in the way of a man who still does not entirely accept that his body is betraying him. But it was not possible. He stood on the tarmac at London Airport as the plane carried Elizabeth and Philip away, and those who were present later said that he looked in that moment very old and very cold, standing in the gray English morning with the wind pulling at his coat. He waved until the aircraft was gone from sight. It was the spring of 1952 that the doctors proposed, with whatever degree of optimism remained available to them, that the king might benefit from a period of convalescence, that the damp and cold of an English winter had not aided his recovery, and that warmth and rest might yet restore something. The plan that was settled upon involved a royal tour of Australia and New Zealand, postponed from the previous year due to the king's illness, and now to be undertaken by Elizabeth and Philip on his behalf. They would travel via Kenya, pausing there for a brief and promised respite, a few days in the bush, away from the duties of the tour before the long journey south and east to the Antipodean realms. Elizabeth said goodbye to her father at London Airport on the last day of January 1952. She kissed him. He stood on the tarmac again, as he had the autumn before, thinner now, the outline of his face more angular beneath the skin, the cold air finding him more easily than it once had. He had his hat in his hand and the wind moved through his thinning hair, and he watched his daughter walk toward the aircraft that would carry her away from him. It was the last time she ever saw him. She and Philip arrived in Kenya in the first days of February. The landscape that received them was one of vast, unhurried drama, the red earth and the dry thorn trees and the enormous sky, and the light that falls over East Africa in a way that is entirely unlike any other light on earth, golden and horizontal and full of suspended dust. They were taken to the Sagana Royal Lodge in Nyeri, a wedding gift from the people of Kenya, a simple, comfortable house in the foothills of Mount Kenya, from which the mountain itself was sometimes visible above the clouds, its peaks carrying the impossible snow of altitude in the middle of the equatorial world. From Sagana, they drove to Treetops. The Treetops Hotel was not, in 1952, the permanent structure it would later become. It was a simple wooden platform, built into the branches of a giant fig tree at the edge of a waterhole and salt lick in the Aberdare forest, where the animals of the African bush came to drink and to graze in the dusk and the darkness. The party climbed the ladder into the treetop structure in the late afternoon, and they settled to watch. As the light changed and the evening deepened, the animals came, rhinoceros and elephant and waterbuck and baboon, moving through the gathering dark with the unhurried purposefulness of creatures entirely untroubled by the presence of human observers above them. Elizabeth watched through the night. She had always had a stillness that suited observation, a patience that most people find difficult to sustain, and here it served her beautifully. She was alive to the scene before her, in the particular way of someone who understands that the natural world conducts its business on its own terms, and that the greatest pleasure available to the human observer is simply to watch without interruption. At some point in the night, the exact hour has never been precisely established, King George VI died. He died at Sandringham in his bed, having spent the evening in evidently good spirits, having been out shooting on the estate during the day, having retired early and asked not to be disturbed. He was found by his valet in the early hours of the 6th of February. The cause was a coronary thrombosis, a blood clot that had stopped his heart quietly in the dark while he slept. He was 56 years old. The news made its way to Kenya with the particular slowness of a world in which communication still depended upon telegrams and telephone lines laid across thousands of miles of ocean and continent. Elizabeth's equerry, Mike Parker, learned of the death from a wire service report. The news had broken in London before the palace's own communication had reached Kenya. He went to Philip, and Philip went to his wife. What he said to her in that moment, and exactly how she received it, is not a scene that history has recorded with precision. The privacy of that particular instant, the moment in which a 25-year-old woman was told that her father was dead, and that she was now the queen, was respected by those who were present in the way that only the most profound human moments tend to be. The witnesses withdrew. Whatever passed between Philip and Elizabeth in those minutes belonged entirely to them. What was observed afterward was this: she was composed. She sat very still for a moment, and then she asked for paper and she began to make notes. There were things that needed to be done. Letters to be written. Decisions to be made. The tour would need to be cancelled. The party would need to return to London. There were the formalities of accession, ancient, fixed, and non-negotiable in their sequence, that needed to begin. She had become queen. Not in a palace, not in a ceremony, not surrounded by the apparatus of the state that she would now lead. She had become queen in the branches of a tree in the Aberdare forest, in the dark, while the elephants moved through the water below. She was 25 years old. The flight back to London was long, and in the early jet age, longer still than it would later become. Elizabeth used the hours in the air to compose herself, to attend to the correspondence that could not wait, and perhaps, alone with her thoughts in whatever small privacy a royal aircraft permitted, to begin the work of understanding what she was now carrying. The woman who landed at London Airport on the afternoon of the 7th of February was dressed in black. She had telegraphed ahead to ensure that a black wardrobe would be brought to the plane before she disembarked, so that she would appear from the first moment she was seen on British soil as queen, dressed as the occasion required. The door of the aircraft opened. She appeared at the top of the steps. Below her on the tarmac stood Winston Churchill, old now but unbowed, the man who had led Britain through its darkest years and had returned just months earlier to the prime ministership he had lost in 1945. He stood in the grey English afternoon and looked up at her. Beside him were other members of the cabinet and officials and dignitaries, each of them facing the extraordinary and strangely ordinary fact that the 25-year-old woman descending toward them was now their sovereign. She greeted them with composure. She shook their hands. She moved through the protocol of the moment without faltering. In the days that followed, she was proclaimed queen across the realms of which she was now head. In Canada, where Prime Minister Louis St. Laurent presided over a nation with a profound constitutional attachment to the crown. In Australia, where Robert Menzies, a royalist of deep and genuine conviction, received the news with an emotion he made no effort to conceal. In New Zealand, in South Africa, in Pakistan, in Ceylon, in each of the 7 independent countries that shared, through the complex and sometimes contradictory machinery of the Commonwealth, the same sovereign. 7 prime ministers, leading 7 nations of vastly different histories and cultures and geographies, now looked to the same young woman as their queen. The weight of it was, by any measure, extraordinary. But Elizabeth had been prepared for weight. She had been being prepared for it, in one way or another, since the December evening in 1936 when her father had become king, and a 10-year-old girl had gone to find him in the drawing room of Royal Lodge. The preparation had taken many forms: lessons in constitutional history, years of public engagement, a war endured and a marriage made and children born, and a father's slow decline witnessed with a love that did not flinch. All of it had been preparation. And now the preparation was over. Queen Elizabeth II had come home. Chapter 4: The Televised Crown, Ritual and Modernization, 1953–1960. London in the early summer of 1953 was a city engaged in the particular English art of celebration under uncertain skies. The bunting had gone up along the Strand, and along the Mall, and along 10,000 streets in 10,000 towns across the country. Red, white, and blue triangles strung between lampposts and shopfronts, fluttering with a patriotic cheerfulness that the weather made no promise to honor. The crowds had begun gathering along the processional route on the 1st of June, sleeping on pavements beneath newspaper and mackintosh, staking their place in the cold and damp, with the patient, slightly manic determination of a people who understood instinctively that some occasions are worth discomfort. The 2nd of June was a Tuesday. It rained. It rained in the way that only an English early summer can, not the dramatic, theatrical rain of a proper storm, but the gray, persistent, apologetic kind, the kind that soaks through everything eventually while somehow maintaining the pretense that it might stop at any moment. It did not stop. The crowd stood in it and did not move, because the thing they had come to see was worth the rain, and they knew it. Inside Westminster Abbey, the preparations that had been 15 months in the making were reaching their completion. The Abbey had been transformed, not altered in its essential character, which was ancient and solemn and entirely itself, but dressed elaborately and reverently for the ceremony it was about to contain. Tiers of seating had been constructed for the 8,000 guests who would witness the coronation: heads of state, prime ministers, representatives of the realms and the Commonwealth, peers of England in their scarlet and ermine, the diplomatic corps of the world. The Abbey smelled of lilies and candle wax, and the particular dry, dusty scent of a stone building that has been holding human occasions for 900 years. And there were cameras. The presence of cameras in Westminster Abbey on the 2nd of June, 1953, was not a foregone conclusion. It had been debated with considerable vigor in the months preceding the coronation. Debated within the government, within the palace, within the circles of those who considered it their responsibility to protect the dignity of the institution from the intrusions of the modern world. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, had reservations. The Queen Mother had reservations. The argument against televising the ceremony was grounded in a concern that was, in its way, entirely sincere. The coronation was not merely a spectacle. It was a sacred rite. The anointing of the sovereign with holy oil, the moment in which the temporal authority of the crown was invested with the blessing of God and the Church, was not, many felt, something to be transmitted into the nation's living rooms, to be watched on a small flickering screen between the tea things and the evening supper. Elizabeth listened to these arguments. She considered them. And she decided, with the quiet decisiveness that was already becoming characteristic of her approach to the great questions of her reign, that the cameras should be admitted. Not to every moment. The anointing itself would take place beneath a canopy, shielded from the lens, but to the ceremony as a whole. The coronation would be televised. The decision was of a significance that extended far beyond the question of broadcasting rights or the dignity of a single ceremony. It was, in retrospect, the moment at which the modern monarchy was born, the moment at which the institution made its commitment, irreversible and far-reaching, to a relationship with the public that was not merely symbolic but intimate. The people would not merely be told that their queen had been crowned. They would see it. They would be there, in every sense that mattered, in the nave of Westminster Abbey, watching the ancient words being spoken and the ancient gestures being made, watching the crown descend upon the head of the 26-year-old woman who was now their sovereign. 20 million people in the United Kingdom alone gathered around television sets on the 2nd of June, 1953. Many watched on sets that were not their own. Neighbors invited neighbors, streets pooled around a single screen, communities formed themselves for a day around the shared experience of watching. Television sets sold in the preceding weeks, at a rate that the industry had never seen. For millions of people, the coronation was the occasion on which they first owned a television, or first sat in front of one. The medium and the moment were, for an enormous number of people, identical. The first thing they ever watched on a screen was the crowning of their queen. Worldwide, the broadcast reached audiences across the Commonwealth and beyond. Film of the ceremony was flown to Canada and the United States, and transmitted within hours. The images of the Abbey, of the procession, of the crown, they circled the globe with a speed that had not been technologically possible even a decade earlier. And they arrived in the homes of people in Vancouver and Sydney and Nairobi and Kingston who watched them with the same absorbed attention as the crowds standing in the rain along the mall. The ceremony itself unfolded with the measured pace of an ancient liturgy, because that is precisely what it was. The service had its roots in the coronation of King Edgar in Bath in the year 973, and its essential structure had been preserved, with adaptations and additions, across nearly 1,000 years of English and then British monarchy. There was something extraordinary in this, that the 26-year-old woman walking in procession through the nave of the Abbey was participating in a ritual that connected her, through an unbroken chain of repetition, to every English monarch who had preceded her. She entered the Abbey in the coronation gown, designed as her wedding dress had been by Norman Hartnell, who had spent months creating something that would be both magnificent and symbolically weighted. The gown was white satin embroidered in gold and silver thread with the floral emblems of the nations of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, the English Tudor rose, the Scottish thistle, the Welsh leek, the Irish shamrock, the Australian wattle, the Canadian maple leaf, the New Zealand silver fern, the South African protea, the lotus flowers of India and Ceylon, the Pakistani wheat and jute. Every nation she represented had its symbol worked into the fabric she wore. She carried her realm upon her dress. The ceremony proceeded through its stages with the solemnity of something that has been done so many times that its seriousness has become inseparable from its form. The recognition, in which the Queen was presented to the congregation at each of the 4 points of the compass, and the people acclaimed her. The oath, in which she promised to govern according to the laws and customs of her peoples, to maintain the Protestant religion, to uphold the Church of England. The anointing, the moment hidden from the cameras, the moment of deepest sacred significance, in which the Archbishop of Canterbury applied the oil of chrism to her hands, her breast and her head with a golden spoon from the 12th century, in a gesture unchanged since the medieval world. And then the investiture, the presentation of the orb, the rod, the ring, the gloves, and finally the crown itself. The St. Edward's crown, the crown of the coronation, worn by every British monarch for over 300 years, is heavy. It weighs nearly 5 pounds and it sits high, its structure of gold worked with rubies and sapphires and amethysts and topaz and tourmalines, rising above the brow with the assertive solidity of something that does not intend to be ignored. The Archbishop of Canterbury placed it upon Elizabeth's head, and as he did so, the peers in the Abbey put on their own coronets, and the trumpet sounded, and the guns of the tower fired their salute, and the crowd outside, those thousands of wet and faithful people along the processional route, heard the distant thunder of the cannon and understood that it was done. She sat in the ancient chair above the stone of destiny, and she was queen, crowned and anointed, the latest in the line that stretched back to the medieval origins of the English state. She was 26 years old. She sat very still, the great crown on her head, her hands folded in her lap, and her face, visible to 20 million people in their living rooms, was calm. The Prime Minister, who watched the coronation with something approaching awe, was an old man by the standards of his office. Winston Churchill was 78 years old in the spring of 1953, a figure of such historical enormousness that his presence in any room altered its atmosphere. He had served the crown across 6 reigns. He had known 4 monarchs. He was, by every measure, a man steeped in the long continuity of British institutional life. And yet his relationship with this young queen, the first of the 15 prime ministers who would serve under her during her reign, was one that he did not expect to move him as profoundly as it did. Their weekly audiences had begun immediately after the accession. Tuesday evenings at Buckingham Palace, or wherever the court happened to be, the Prime Minister admitted to the Queen's presence for a private conversation that was understood by long constitutional convention to be entirely confidential. No minutes were kept. No record was made. The sovereign and her First Minister spoke freely, and what passed between them remained between them, a privacy that both parties honored absolutely. It was one of the features of the British Constitution that existed not in any statute or formal document, but in the habitual practice of centuries, and it was one that Elizabeth embraced from the very beginning with a conviction that never wavered. She had been prepared for these audiences. Walter Bagehot, the 19th-century constitutional scholar whose analysis of the monarchy remained, in the middle of the 20th century, the most lucid available, had identified the sovereign's 3 rights: the right to be consulted, the right to encourage, and the right to warn. Elizabeth had studied Bagehot. She understood what the audiences were for, not to exercise political power, which the constitutional monarch does not possess, but to provide a forum in which the relationship between the crown and the government could be tended, honestly and without the distortions of party interest or public performance. In those private Tuesday evenings, she could ask the questions that no newspaper would allow, say the things that no speech could contain, and be, in whatever limited degree the Constitution permitted, genuinely useful. Churchill, who had expected, as some in government had expected, to find in the young queen a pleasant but perhaps not particularly searching interlocutor, discovered something rather different. She had read her papers with close attention. She asked questions that indicated she had thought seriously about what she had read. She retained information with a precision that occasionally startled those who briefed her. She was not, beneath the composure and the courtesy, a passive figure. She was engaged. The relationship between them was not without its complications. Churchill was old, and occasionally forgetful, and inclined toward the long reminiscence when the business of the evening required brevity. He adored the Queen in the particular manner of a man of the Victorian era, who has spent a lifetime in the company of great events, and finds, in the young woman before him, an embodiment of something he has always revered: the crown itself, the continuity of England, the idea of a country that has endured. But his adoration did not prevent her from gently, persistently pressing for the things she needed from her government. And it did not prevent him from being, on occasion, surprised by the firmness beneath the grace. He retired in April of 1955, handing over to Anthony Eden, a man of considerably different temperament, distinguished and somewhat brittle, who had waited a long time for the premiership and found almost immediately that its burdens did not suit his constitution. The test that would break Eden's government arrived in the summer of 1956, from the deserts of Egypt. The Suez Canal had been nationalized by Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian president, on the 26th of July, seized from the Anglo-French company that had operated it, removed from the sphere of Western influence in a single dramatic act that Eden received as an intolerable provocation, a challenge that must be answered with force. What followed was a sequence of events that would expose with painful clarity the distance between Britain's self-image and its actual standing in the post-war world. Eden, in secret concert with France and Israel, planned a military operation to retake the canal. The Israelis would attack Egypt from the east. The British and French would intervene under the pretext of separating the combatants, occupying the canal zone in the process. The operation was executed in late October and early November, and then it collapsed. Not militarily, which had proceeded much as planned, but politically, which had not been planned at all for the way it actually unfolded. The United States, under President Eisenhower, was furious. The Soviet Union issued threats. The United Nations condemned the operation. The pound came under pressure that threatened a sterling crisis of serious proportions. And Washington made its position plain: if Britain wished to avoid financial catastrophe, it would need to cease its military action and withdraw. Britain withdrew. The humiliation was profound and, in its way, definitive. What Suez demonstrated, unmistakably, and without the possibility of comfortable reinterpretation, was that Britain was no longer a great power in the traditional sense, that its freedom of unilateral action in the world had ended, that the age of empire was not merely philosophically over but practically over, confirmed in the hard currency of American displeasure and financial dependency. Eden, his health destroyed and his political position untenable, resigned in January of 1957. For the Queen, Suez had been a period of acute constitutional tension. She did not speak publicly about the crisis. The political neutrality that was her constitutional obligation required that she refrain from expressing any view on the policy, but those around her understood that she was deeply troubled, and not only by the strategic catastrophe that Suez represented. Her Commonwealth was fracturing over the issue. Canada and other dominions were appalled by the British action, and the bonds of the Commonwealth, already under strain as the movement toward independence gathered momentum across Asia and Africa, were further tested by the sense that Britain had acted not merely foolishly, but in bad faith. She had spoken in the early months of her reign of the Commonwealth as the great project of her sovereign life, the institution she intended to serve and to strengthen. Suez had placed that institution under a stress it would take years to repair. Eden's successor was Harold Macmillan, a man of greater steadiness and greater political skill, who arrived at the premiership with the particular calm of someone who has survived long enough in public life to know that the worst things can be outlasted. He would preside over a period of economic recovery and of the decolonization that was remaking the map of the world. The Queen and Macmillan developed a working relationship of genuine mutual regard. He was, like Churchill, a figure of the old school, a man who understood the constitutional proprieties and observed them with conviction. In October of 1957, Elizabeth visited the United States. She and Philip arrived in Washington, where she was received by President Eisenhower, the former supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe, a man whose relationship with Britain was complex and historically layered, shaped by the wartime alliance and by the tensions of Suez, which lay barely a year in the past. The visit was intended in part to repair something, to demonstrate that the special relationship between Britain and America, that complicated and occasionally fraught partnership of language and history and shared interest, was still alive and still valued on both sides. She addressed the United Nations General Assembly in New York. It was the first time a British monarch had spoken to the world's primary international body, and the occasion was, in its way, a statement of intent. The Queen of the United Kingdom, standing before the assembled representatives of the nations of the world, and speaking in the language of international cooperation and Commonwealth partnership. The hall of the General Assembly was vast, and the delegates who filled it came from every political tradition and every cultural background, and yet the figure at the podium commanded the room's attention with the effortless authority of someone who has never, in any of the rooms she has entered, failed to fill it. The address was careful and considered and warmly received. She spoke of the Commonwealth as a model for a certain kind of international relationship, voluntary, diverse, bound not by compulsion but by shared history and common values. She spoke of the importance of the young nations that were emerging from the process of decolonization, and of Britain's commitment to their development. The speech was not a rhetorical masterpiece in the conventional sense, but it was the speech of a woman who meant what she said, and the audience understood that. In the art of international diplomacy, sincerity is more rare than eloquence, and considerably more valuable. The world was changing around her, and she was changing with it, or more precisely, she was finding the ways in which the institution she embodied could engage with change without losing the essential character that gave it its meaning and its durability. The great question of the monarchy's relationship with modernity was one that she would wrestle with in various forms for the entirety of her reign. How does an ancient institution maintain its relevance without surrendering its distinctiveness? How does a sovereign who reigns but does not govern make herself genuinely useful to the people she serves? There were no easy answers. There was only the daily, patient work of trying. In the spring of 1960, a birth. The Queen's third child, the first to be born to a reigning British monarch since Queen Victoria had given birth to Prince Leopold in 1853, arrived on the 19th of February. Andrew Albert Christian Edward Prince Andrew, fair and robust from the beginning, possessed of an energy that would characterize him throughout his life. He was born at Buckingham Palace, as his mother's position required, and the nation's response was one of warm delight. There is always something particular in the birth of a child to a sovereign. A sense that the dynasty is renewing itself, that the future is not merely an abstraction but a living, breathing thing. Elizabeth had been married for 12 years. She had been queen for 8. She had navigated a constitutional crisis of the first order, established the rhythm of her relationship with her government, addressed the world's foremost international body, and continued in the face of all the pressures and demands of her position to be recognizably herself, contained and warm and purposeful, possessed of a sense of humor that occasionally surprised those who expected only formality, and of a faith that sustained her in ways she rarely made explicit but that was evident to those who knew her in everything she did. The 1950s were over. The 1960s were beginning. The world was about to change again, and change dramatically, in its music, in its politics, in its social arrangements, in the relationship between young people and the institutions that their parents had built and maintained and believed in. The monarchy that Elizabeth had inherited was, in many respects, the monarchy of her grandfather's era, formal, distant, inscrutable in its privacy. The monarchy she was making day by day, in the small decisions and the large ones, was something different. Not yet fully visible. Not yet complete. But moving, steadily and deliberately, in a direction that she had chosen. The cameras had been inside Westminster Abbey. The people had seen their queen crowned. The distance between the throne and the daily life of the nation had been, by that single decision on a rainy June morning in 1953, permanently and irrevocably altered. What remained to be understood was how far the alteration could go, and how much further it would need to. Chapter 5, Winds of Change, Decolonization and Commonwealth, 1961 to 1976. The map of the world was being redrawn. Not slowly, not cautiously, not with the measured deliberation of diplomats working across decades toward a gradual resolution, but rapidly, almost vertiginously, in the great rushing tide of decolonization that was remaking the political geography of Africa and Asia and the Caribbean with a speed that seemed, to those living through it, both historically inevitable and practically astonishing. In 1960, 17 African nations gained independence in a single year. 17 countries in a single calendar year, moving from colonial status to sovereign nationhood, each raising a new flag, each taking its seat in the United Nations, each beginning the enormous, complex, uncertain work of self-governance. Britain stood at the center of this transformation in a way that no other country did. The empire it was relinquishing was the largest the world had ever seen. A web of territories and peoples and relationships that had been assembled over 3 centuries, through conquest and commerce, and the particular genius of British administration for making itself seem, at least from London, permanent. It was not permanent. Nothing of that kind ever is. And Harold Macmillan, speaking to the South African Parliament in Cape Town in February of 1960, gave the transformation its defining phrase. He spoke of the wind of change blowing through the continent of Africa. A phrase that acknowledged with unusual candor for a serving British Prime Minister that the empire was ending, that the tide of nationalism was irresistible, and that Britain's task was no longer to resist it but to manage it with as much grace and wisdom as could be brought to bear. Elizabeth had been thinking about these questions since before she became queen. The Commonwealth, that voluntary association of independent nations that had evolved from the empire, bound not by constitutional compulsion but by shared history and, the Queen believed, shared values, was the institution she regarded as the most important and most personal of her sovereign responsibilities. She had said so explicitly in her 21st birthday address, broadcast from Cape Town in 1947, when she had dedicated her life, in a declaration that those who heard it understood to be entirely sincere, to the service of the great imperial family to which she belonged. In the years since, as that family had changed its character, shedding the hierarchies of empire and replacing them imperfectly but genuinely with something closer to a fellowship of equals, she had changed with it, and done so without evident reluctance. The Commonwealth, by the early 1960s, was an organization of extraordinary diversity. It contained the old white dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, whose attachment to the crown had deep roots in culture and sentiment. It contained the newly independent nations of Asia and Africa, whose relationship with Britain was necessarily more complicated, colored by the experience of colonialism and the ambivalences that experience produced. It contained republics that had chosen to remain within the association while recognizing no allegiance to the crown. It contained monarchies, constitutional and otherwise. It contained, in short, the world in miniature. All the variety and contradiction and potential of the human family, gathered into an institution whose purpose was to demonstrate that cooperation was possible across the chasms of history and difference. Elizabeth was its head. Not its head of government. The Commonwealth had no government, no parliament, no mechanisms of enforcement. She was its symbolic center, the human embodiment of the continuity it represented, and she took this role with a seriousness that occasionally surprised those who expected a more purely ceremonial engagement. The Commonwealth mattered to her. Not as an abstraction, not as a diplomatic convenience, but as a real and living thing, a network of human relationships, of peoples whose future she felt genuinely invested in, of countries whose independence she welcomed not as a loss but as a fulfillment. In 1961, she went to India. No reigning British monarch had visited India since King George V, 50 years earlier, and the India that George had visited was a very different place, a jewel of empire, the centerpiece of the imperial project, the country for which the title emperor had been created and for which it had eventually been relinquished. The India that Elizabeth visited in 1961 was a republic, 14 years into its independence, the largest democracy in the world, governed by Jawaharlal Nehru, a man of extraordinary intellectual distinction and complex feelings about Britain, shaped by the years of colonial resistance and the Cambridge education that had prepared him for leadership while simultaneously showing him the culture of the people he was resisting. The tour was the first by a reigning British monarch in half a century, and it was understood by everyone involved as a statement about the new relationship between Britain and its former subjects, a relationship no longer defined by the authority of empire but by the possibility of partnership. She arrived in Delhi and was received with the elaborate ceremonial that India, drawing on its own ancient traditions of hospitality, could deploy with magnificent effect. There were parades and state banquets, and visits to hospitals and universities, and housing developments and ancient monuments. She rode in a state carriage through streets lined with hundreds of thousands of people, and the crowds were enormous, and the enthusiasm was genuine, and it was clear that whatever complicated feelings the Indian people might harbor about the history of British rule, they were willing to extend to the young queen a warmth that was personal and not merely diplomatic. She visited Pakistan as well, driving through Karachi and Lahore and engaging with the leadership of a country that had already, in 1956, become a republic within the Commonwealth, relinquishing the crown as head of state while choosing to remain within the association. Pakistan's decision to remain in the Commonwealth as a republic had been at the time a significant moment. It established the precedent that the Commonwealth could accommodate republics, that shared history and values were sufficient bonds without the requirement of a shared monarch. Elizabeth had supported this model, understanding that the alternative, insisting on the crown as a condition of Commonwealth membership, would rapidly reduce the association to a small club of the old white dominions. She was also in the business, closer to home, of a different kind of change of a more domestic and constitutional variety, but not without its own complications. Harold Macmillan had been managing the country's affairs since 1957, navigating the aftermath of Suez, with the steady pragmatism of a man who accepted reality as he found it rather than as he wished it to be. He had overseen the acceleration of decolonization with something approaching equanimity, guided by the understanding that an empire released gracefully would leave fewer scars than one held by force until it tore itself free. He had also presided over a period of genuine economic improvement and a relaxation of the austerity that had characterized the post-war decade. Britain was, by the early 1960s, beginning to feel prosperous again, or at least some parts of Britain were. The advertising industry had discovered the young. The pop music business was discovering the same thing. Something was loosening in the culture, something that would, within a few years, become the defining social phenomenon of the decade. But Macmillan's government was not immune to misfortune. The Profumo affair, the scandal involving the Secretary of State for War, a showgirl, and a Soviet naval attaché, and the discovery that Profumo had lied about the relationship to the House of Commons, detonated in the spring of 1963 with the force of a weapon aimed directly at the conservative establishment. The damage was political and also cultural. It confirmed for those who were disposed to believe it that the old ruling class was not merely fallible but decadent, that the men who had governed Britain through the war and into the peace were not the austere paragons of duty their public manner suggested. The scandal did not destroy Macmillan, but it wounded him deeply, and in October of 1963, his health failing and his authority diminished, he resigned from the premiership. What followed placed the Queen in a position of constitutional delicacy that she had not previously encountered and would not entirely enjoy. The Conservative Party in 1963 had no formal mechanism for electing its leader. The Prime Minister emerged when a vacancy arose through a process described with the deliberate vagueness of the customary processes of consultation, soundings taken among cabinet members and senior party figures, advice tendered to the sovereign, a recommendation made. The sovereign then invited the person most likely to command a parliamentary majority to form a government. The process had worked tolerably well in the past. It did not work well in October of 1963. Macmillan, operating from a hospital bed at King Edward VII's Hospital for Officers, where he was recovering from prostate surgery, conducted his own consultation with considerable energy and considerable partisanship, and the advice he tendered to the Queen pointed toward Lord Home, Alec Douglas Home, the Foreign Secretary, a Scottish aristocrat of impeccable establishment credentials and no particular popular recognition. The advice was contested. Rab Butler, who was widely regarded as the ablest candidate and who had expected to succeed, was passed over. Ian MacLeod and Enoch Powell refused to serve under Home. Elizabeth acted on the advice she received. She invited Douglas Home to form a government. He did so, renouncing his peerage to enter the House of Commons as Sir Alec Douglas Home, and governed for less than a year before losing the general election of October 1964 to Harold Wilson's Labour Party. The criticism that followed centered less on Douglas Home himself, who was, by general agreement, a man of honesty and personal decency, than on the process by which he had been chosen, and on the Queen's role within it. Some argued that she had been poorly advised, that the consultation Macmillan had conducted was biased toward his preferred outcome, that she had been, in the clinical phrase of her critics, insufficiently skeptical of the advice she received. The criticism was not entirely fair. She had acted within the conventions of the Constitution as they then existed, and those conventions placed her in a position of genuine dependence on the advice of her ministers. But it was uncomfortable, and it was instructive. The Conservative Party drew its own conclusions. By 1965, it had introduced a formal mechanism for electing its leader by a vote of its parliamentary members. The era of the customary processes of consultation, with all their opacity and all their potential for manipulation, was over. Elizabeth would never again be required to choose a conservative prime minister on the basis of advice rather than democratic mandate. It was a change she was not sorry to see. Harold Wilson, who arrived at Downing Street in October of 1964, was a man from a completely different world than his predecessors, the son of a Yorkshire industrial chemist, educated at Oxford by ability and scholarship rather than by family tradition. A man of the grammar school meritocracy who wore a mackintosh where his predecessors had worn Savile Row suits and smoked a pipe where Churchill had smoked a cigar. He and the Queen were, in background and temperament, as different as two people can be, while occupying adjacent positions in the same constitutional structure. And yet their weekly audiences, by the accounts of those privy to them, worked. She was curious about him. He was respectful of her. The constitutional relationship was served, and served well, by mutual goodwill and mutual professionalism, across the deep cultural distance between them. The most vexing international question of the Wilson years was Rhodesia, the white minority-governed colony in southern Africa, whose government under Ian Smith made a unilateral declaration of independence in November of 1965, rather than accept the British condition of majority rule as a prerequisite for legal independence. The UDI, as it was universally abbreviated, placed the Queen in an acutely uncomfortable position. Rhodesia's white settlers were, in many cases, people of British descent, British sentiment, British cultural identification, people who had framed their rebellion in the language of loyalty to the Crown, claiming paradoxically that they were being more faithful to the values of the old empire than the government in London that was trying to end it. They had even declared their independence with extraordinary political audacity in the name of Queen Elizabeth II. She was not amused. The appropriation of her name for a purpose she did not sanction and a cause she did not support was a political embarrassment of a particular kind, the kind that could not be addressed directly without the Queen stepping outside her constitutional role. She said nothing publicly. She acted through her ministers. Britain imposed sanctions. The Commonwealth, whose black African members regarded the Rhodesian situation as a test of Britain's commitment to the principles of majority rule and human equality, watched with close and critical attention. The crisis would not be finally resolved until the Lancaster House Agreement of 1979, nearly 15 years later. It was in this context, of a Commonwealth under perpetual strain, of a world in which the old certainties of empire were dissolving into the new uncertainties of independence, that the Queen undertook in 1968, a journey that had never been made before by any British sovereign. She visited South America. The continent had historical ties to Britain through commerce and culture, and the particular influence that British capital and British engineering had exercised across the 19th century, but it had never been visited by a reigning monarch. She went to Chile and to Brazil, and the reception she received carried the warmth of the genuinely unexpected, people who had not imagined such a visit possible, receiving it with the pleasure of the surprised. In 1969, a decision was made that would prove in retrospect more consequential than it appeared at the time. The royal family would permit the filming of a documentary, a fly-on-the-wall portrait of the institution and the family that inhabited it, intended to humanize the crown and bring the public closer to the reality of royal life. The film, titled simply Royal Family, was the brainchild of the Queen's press secretary, William Heseltine, and Prince Philip, who had been arguing for some time that the monarchy needed to engage more openly with the modern media environment. It was directed by Richard Costin, and it ran for 110 minutes. The cameras followed the family through the year, at Balmoral and at Buckingham Palace and on tour, at the dinner table and at the barbecue, in private moments and public ones. The Queen was seen doing things that the public had never seen her do, laughing at a private joke, talking to her children about ordinary subjects, driving her car on the Balmoral estate, buying sweets at a village shop. The film was not by any stretch an unmediated view of royal life. It was carefully edited, and the family knew they were being filmed, which necessarily shaped what they chose to do and say in front of the lens. But its effect was startling nonetheless. It was watched by 30 million people in the United Kingdom alone. It was sold to broadcasters in 140 countries worldwide. It was, by every measure of audience and impact, a phenomenon. The reactions to it were instructive. Many viewers were charmed, delighted to discover that the family behind the formality was recognizably human, that the Queen laughed, that her children were ordinary in the best sense of the word, that the palace contained rooms that looked like the rooms of wealthy but not impossibly remote people. There was warmth in the response, a sense of recognition, of common humanity discovered across the formidable distance of institution and protocol. But there were others who felt something different. Some historians, and some of those closest to the monarchy, would argue in subsequent years that the film had given away something that could not be recovered, that the mystique of the crown, its deliberate inscrutability, its maintenance of a distance that allowed the public imagination to fill the space with reverence, had been compromised. The queen was not a goddess or a symbol or an abstraction. She was a woman who bought sweets and laughed at jokes and drove her own car. This was humanizing, yes. But was it entirely wise? The question of how much visibility serves and how much destroys was one that the royal family would continue to negotiate in different forms and with different degrees of success for the rest of the century. Prince Edward, the Queen's fourth child, had been born in March of 1964, a second son, and then later in the counting of the family, its youngest member, the child who would grow up in the most fully documented version of royal childhood, navigating the particular pressures of a position defined by proximity to power without direct access to it. He was a quiet, studious child, observant in the way of those who grow up watching older siblings occupy the center of attention, finding their own understanding of the world in careful observation rather than active seizure. By the mid-1970s, the Commonwealth had continued its transformation. Ceylon, which had become independent in 1948 and retained the Queen as head of state, became a republic in 1972, taking the name Sri Lanka. Malta, the small Mediterranean island that had been the scene of Elizabeth's happiest early married years, followed in 1974. Each change required an adjustment, not merely diplomatic but personal, because these were not abstract constitutional events to Elizabeth. They were alterations in relationships she had invested in, with countries she had visited and people she had come to know. She received each change without evident bitterness, understanding it as the natural development of the independence she had always, in her deepest convictions, supported. South Africa, whose apartheid government had taken the country out of the Commonwealth in 1961, rather than face the censure of its members over the policy of racial segregation, remained a troubling presence in the background of these years. A country with which Britain had the deepest historical ties and the most painful political disagreements. A country that would remain, until the eventual dismantling of apartheid, a source of tension within the Commonwealth and a test of the association's stated commitment to racial equality. These were the winds of change, blowing through the institutions and the relationships and the constitutional arrangements of the mid-20th century, altering everything they touched, demanding a kind of flexibility from the monarchy that the monarchy had not always historically been willing to provide. Elizabeth provided it. She bent without breaking. She adapted without abandoning the core of what she was and what she believed. The Commonwealth she tended through the 1960s and 70s was smaller than the empire from which it had grown, and less powerful in the conventional sense, and considerably less certain of its own purpose and coherence. But it was still there. It was still meeting, still talking, still attempting, imperfectly and sometimes contentiously, to demonstrate that the nations of the world, for all their differences, could find in shared history and shared aspiration something worth preserving. She believed this. She had always believed it. And her belief, patient, consistent, unshowy in its expression but granite firm in its foundations, was, in the long reckoning of history, perhaps the most important single factor in the Commonwealth's survival through the turbulent decades of its making. Chapter 6, Jubilees and Tensions, the Thatcher Era, 1977 to 1991. In the summer of 1977, Britain paused. It paused in the way that only a nation with a deep and practiced relationship with ceremony can pause, not from exhaustion or despair, though there was plenty of both available, but from something more deliberate and more generous. The country was, by most measurable indicators, in a difficult state. Inflation had ravaged the economy through the middle years of the decade. The winter of 1976 had brought a sterling crisis of humiliating proportions, requiring the Labour government of James Callaghan to seek a loan from the International Monetary Fund, an institution associated in the public mind with the financial emergencies of developing nations, not the proud economies of former empires. Unemployment was rising. Industrial relations were a battlefield. The social fabric in certain respects felt frayed. And yet, in June of 1977, the people came out. They came out in numbers that surprised even those who had organized the celebrations, who had hoped for enthusiasm, and received something closer to fervor. Street parties materialized in their thousands, long trestle tables draped in red, white, and blue, laden with sandwiches and sausage rolls and Victoria sponge, running down the middle of roads that had been closed to traffic and open to the neighborhood. In London, the crowds along the Mall were enormous, patient in the English manner, cheerful in the English manner, holding their Union flags and their paper cups of tea, and waiting for the golden coach to pass. Across the country, bonfires were lit on hilltops in a chain that stretched from the Scottish Highlands to the Cornish coast, an echo of the ancient signal fire networks of a pre-electric age, revived for an occasion that felt to those who participated in it genuinely and unreservedly joyful. 25 years. Elizabeth had been queen for 25 years. She had come to the throne as a young woman of 25, and now she was 51, not old, but matured in the way that 25 years of continuous, unrelenting public service matures a person, which is to say in ways that are not always visible on the surface but that run deep. She had seen 7 prime ministers come and go. She had presided over the dissolution of empire and the construction of the Commonwealth. She had navigated constitutional crises, diplomatic confrontations, family complications, and the unceasing scrutiny of a press that had grown over the decade, increasingly aggressive in its pursuit of the private lives of public figures. She had done all of this without a public complaint, without a visible loss of composure, without a single interview in which she had offered the world her own perspective on any of it. The Silver Jubilee was the public's answer to all of that. It was not, at its heart, a celebration of the institution, though the institution benefited. It was a celebration of the woman. Whatever the British people thought about the monarchy in the abstract, whatever their views on the constitutional arrangements, or the costs of the civil list, or the relevance of hereditary privilege in a democratic age, in June of 1977, the answer of the streets was clear. They loved her. They had watched her for 25 years, through the television and the newspapers, and the occasional appearance at a local event that left a residue of personal memory. And they had reached a conclusion that economic analysis and political theory could not touch. She was theirs, and they were glad of it. She processed through London in the Golden State Coach, the great Baroque vehicle built in 1762 that had carried British monarchs to their coronations and their jubilees for 2 centuries, drawn by 8 grey horses through streets lined with cheering crowds. She attended a service of Thanksgiving at St. Paul's Cathedral. She lit a bonfire beacon in Windsor Great Park. She toured the country and the Commonwealth in the months that followed, traveling to Northern Ireland, to Scotland, to Wales, to Australia and New Zealand and the Caribbean and the Pacific Islands, thousands of miles of royal progress, greeting hundreds of thousands of people in an extended act of national communion that left her, by all accounts, genuinely moved. She had, at the service of Thanksgiving, spoken quietly to those near her about the people she had seen, the faces she had encountered along the route. She had been struck, she said, by the warmth. She had not expected it to be quite so, she searched for the word, quite so personal. It was personal. It had always been personal. That was what she had never entirely understood about her relationship with the public, or rather, what she had understood intellectually, but occasionally lost sight of, in the daily management of the institution. The people did not love the crown in the abstract. They loved her specifically, this particular woman, with her corgis and her horses and her sensible shoes and her remarkable composure, the woman who had been their queen since they were children or since before they were born, the constant in a world of inconstant things. But the world would not remain in the warm amber of the Jubilee summer. The world rarely does. Margaret Hilda Thatcher became Prime Minister on the 4th of May, 1979, and the era she inaugurated was one of the most dramatic and divisive in modern British political history. She was the first woman to hold the office, a distinction that was in itself historically enormous, and she arrived at Downing Street with a conviction of purpose that was, even by the standards of British politicians, unusual in its intensity. She believed she knew what was wrong with Britain, and she believed she knew how to fix it, and she was entirely prepared to be unpopular in the process of fixing it, because she did not, at her core, place a particularly high value on being liked. 2 women, then, at the summit of British public life in the 1980s. 2 women of roughly the same generation. Thatcher was 6 months older than the Queen, both shaped by the war, both products of a Britain that expected women to find their limits and stay within them, both of whom had found by very different means and through very different temperaments their way to positions of extraordinary power. The comparison was inevitable, and the press made it repeatedly, with varying degrees of insight and varying degrees of accuracy. What is certain is that their relationship was complex, and that complexity was not merely temperamental. On a personal level, those who observed both women at close quarters noted fundamental differences of manner and style. Thatcher was voluble where the Queen was economical. Thatcher wore her opinions as others wear their clothes, visibly, unmistakably, without apparent interest in concealing them. The Queen had spent 30 years perfecting the art of the unexpressed opinion, the neutral response, the face that gave nothing away to the observing lens. Thatcher, by contrast, was constitutionally incapable of a neutral response. She had a view on everything, and she communicated it with the aggressive clarity of a woman who had spent her career making herself heard in rooms full of men who would rather she were not there. The Prime Minister was, by tradition, supposed to maintain certain courtesies in the relationship with the sovereign, to consult, to inform, to seek the weekly audience as a genuine engagement rather than a bureaucratic ritual. Those around the Queen have suggested, with the careful circumlocution that royal circles require, that Thatcher's approach to the audiences was not always what it might have been. She was not, it is gently implied, the most receptive of listeners in those private Tuesday evenings. She had a program. She had a mission. The Queen's constitutionally protected right to encourage and to warn had value only if the person being warned was inclined to receive the warning, and Thatcher was not always so inclined. The issue that brought the distance between them into sharpest relief was the Commonwealth, and specifically, the question of South Africa. Apartheid, the system of racial segregation institutionalized in South African law since 1948, had been a source of contention within the Commonwealth since the country's expulsion from the organization in 1961. By the 1980s, the pressure on Western governments to impose economic sanctions against the South African regime had become intense, driven by the international anti-apartheid movement, by the suffering of black South Africans, and by the moral clarity of leaders like Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela, whose imprisonment on Robben Island had made him one of the most powerful symbols of the era. The Commonwealth's position was unambiguous. Sanctions were necessary, and Britain, as the leading member of the association and the country with the most extensive trade and investment ties to South Africa, should lead. Thatcher's position was equally unambiguous and equally firmly held. Sanctions did not work, would damage the British economy, and would harm the black South Africans they were intended to help. She would not impose them. The Commonwealth heads of government meetings of this period were events of considerable tension, in which Thatcher stood largely alone against the overwhelming consensus of the other member states, arguing her position with the unflinching directness that was her defining characteristic. It was reported, through the careful channels by which such things are always reported from within the palace, that the Queen was deeply concerned about the Commonwealth's cohesion. The association that she regarded as the great project of her reign was fracturing over the sanctions question, and the primary obstacle to the consensus that might have held it together was her own Prime Minister. The palace is said to have briefed, with unusual explicitness for an institution of its habitual discretion, that the Queen's views on Commonwealth sanctions were not those of her government. This was, constitutionally, a statement of considerable boldness. The sovereign does not customarily permit it to be known that she holds views on matters of political controversy that differ from those of her ministers. The briefing, and it was a genuine briefing, not a rumor, suggested that the Commonwealth mattered enough to Elizabeth to justify a departure from her customary studied neutrality, even at the cost of the appearance of political partisanship. Thatcher pressed on. The sanctions were not imposed by Britain. The Commonwealth came closer to fracture over South Africa than over any previous issue. It held together, though the holding was not easy. The Queen's personal investment in maintaining the association, communicated through her attendance at Commonwealth gatherings, and through her evident warmth toward the leaders of its African and Caribbean members, played a role in keeping the relationship alive through the political storms of the decade. The 1980s were also the years in which the royal family became, in a way that had never quite been true before, the subject of a permanent and voracious media entertainment. The wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer on the 29th of July, 1981, had been one of the great spectacles of the decade. A ceremony of extraordinary splendor watched by an estimated global television audience of 750 million people, a number that strained the borders of comprehension. The procession along the Mall, the crowd filling every available space from Buckingham Palace to St. Paul's Cathedral, the bride in her remarkable dress, the dress whose train was so long it had to be carefully folded into the glass coach, and the young prince at the altar had produced a day of such concentrated public feeling that those who lived through it rarely forgot where they were when it happened. But the wedding was also the beginning of something else, something that would, in time, become one of the most painful episodes in the history of the modern monarchy. Diana was 20 years old when she married Charles. She was beautiful and unformed and entirely unprepared for the scale of what she had entered, the machinery of royal life, its protocols and its distances, its expectations of emotional containment, its relentless public exposure. She was a natural communicator in the instinctive, spontaneous sense. She touched people, literally and figuratively, in ways that cut through the glass wall of royal formality and made direct human contact. The public loved her immediately and without reservation. Charles and Diana were not, it became apparent with the slow, private accumulation of evidence, compatible. They were different in temperament, different in need, different in their understanding of what the marriage had been and what it was required to be. The tensions within their marriage were private for some time, managed, as royal difficulties have always been managed, through discretion and the considerable buffer of palace protocol. But the British tabloid press of the 1980s was not an institution inclined toward discretion, and the appetite of the reading public for stories about Diana was effectively limitless. The market existed. The supply followed. The decade in which the Queen found herself presiding was, in certain respects, a hall of distorting mirrors. The institution she led was simultaneously more visible and more distorted than it had ever been. The cameras had been let in stages since the coronation, and what the cameras had found was a family of flesh and blood, with the imperfections that implies, and the tabloid press had taken those imperfections and illuminated them with a light so bright and so unceasing that the shadows fell in all directions. She managed it, with the equanimity that was her habitual response to the unmanageable. She did not give interviews about her feelings. She did not commission sympathetic newspaper profiles. She continued her weekly audiences, her state occasions, her tours and visits and engagements, the unbroken daily rhythm of duty that had sustained her since the moment she stepped off the aircraft at London Airport in the dark clothes of bereavement in February of 1952. In June of 1981, on the occasion of the annual Trooping the Colour ceremony, the formal celebration of the sovereign's official birthday, a pageant of military precision conducted on Horse Guards Parade, a 17-year-old named Marcus Sargent stepped forward from the crowd along the Mall and fired 6 shots at the Queen as she rode her mare Burmese in the procession. The shots were blank. He had been unable to obtain live ammunition, but Elizabeth did not know this, and neither, for the several seconds it took to understand what had happened, did anyone else. Burmese shied violently at the sound of the shots. The crowd, in the frozen moment of shock before the reaction came, was utterly silent. Elizabeth held her horse. She held her with a steadiness that those who observed it found extraordinary. Not merely the physical steadiness of an experienced rider, but the steadiness of a person who had decided, in the fraction of a second available to her, that she would not permit whatever had just happened to unhorse her. She patted Burmese's neck. She straightened. And she rode on. The crowd, released from its shock, responded with a roar. The procession continued. The ceremony was completed. Afterward, she was seen to shake slightly, the body's reckoning with adrenaline, the payment that composure extracts when the danger is past. But during the moment itself, on the Mall, in the sudden silence after the shots, she had been perfectly, absolutely still. She was 55 years old. She had been queen for 29 years. She was riding a horse that a gun had startled, in front of a crowd of thousands, with cameras broadcasting the scene to a worldwide audience. And she had simply ridden on. The China visit came in October of 1986. No British monarch had ever visited the People's Republic of China, a country that had, since the Revolution of 1949, been largely closed to the kind of diplomatic engagement that state visits represent, and whose relationship with Britain was complicated by the question of Hong Kong, the colony whose lease was due to expire in 1997, and whose future was, by the mid-1980s, the subject of delicate and consequential negotiation. Elizabeth's visit was a statement of intent, a demonstration that Britain wished to pursue a relationship with China that was forward-looking, built on the realities of the present rather than the resentments of history. She and Philip arrived in Beijing and were received with the ceremony that the Chinese state could deploy with considerable grandeur when the occasion required it. They visited the Forbidden City and walked along the Great Wall and attended the formal banquets that are the machinery of state visits everywhere, those long tables and elaborate toasts and careful speeches that accumulate over the days of a diplomatic program into something that is partly ritual and partly genuine communication between people who have been given by the occasion a framework within which to begin. She met Chinese leaders with the composure and the curiosity that she brought to every such encounter, the patient, focused attention of a woman who understood that these meetings mattered and who gave them the full weight of her engagement. Through all of these years, the Jubilee, the Thatcher confrontations, the tabloid storms, the diplomatic firsts, she continued to inhabit with complete seriousness the ancient ceremonial roles that connected the crown to the deeper strata of English history. She was the Duke of Lancaster, the historic title by which the sovereign holds the Duchy of Lancaster, the estate of land and property whose revenues support the crown, and she was by ancient custom the Seigneur of the Swans, the monarch's claim to ownership of all unmarked mute swans in open waters in England and Wales, a tradition whose origins lay in the medieval economy when the swan was a prized source of food for royal banquets. These titles were not, of course, politically significant. They connected nothing to the daily governance of the country. But they connected everything to the long continuity of the institution, to the idea that the crown was not merely a modern constitutional arrangement, but the living residue of a history that stretched back through the centuries to the world from which England had formed itself. She wore these ancient designations lightly but genuinely, understanding them for what they were, threads that ran from the present back through the centuries, binding the living institution to its own deep past. By the end of the 1980s, the world was changing again, changing with the dramatic, almost theatrical suddenness that sometimes visits history after decades of slow preparation. The Berlin Wall fell in November of 1989, and with it fell the architecture of the Cold War that had defined international relations since before Elizabeth had come to the throne. The Soviet Empire, the great rival and counterweight to the Western order in which the British monarchy was embedded, was dissolving. Eastern Europe was transforming itself with a speed that left observers breathless. The world that would follow was not yet visible, but the world that was ending was unmistakable. Thatcher herself fell in November of 1990, not at the hands of the electorate, which had returned her 3 times, but at the hands of her own parliamentary party, which had concluded that she had become an electoral liability and a governmental impossibility. She was in Paris when the final vote came, at a summit on the Charter of Paris, the document that was attempting to build the architecture of the post-Cold War world, and she flew back to London and faced the mathematics of the ballot and accepted in the end what the mathematics required. She resigned. John Major succeeded her. Elizabeth received the news with the composure she brought to all political transitions. The sovereign endures, the governments change, and the duty of the crown is to facilitate the change and then to serve whoever emerges from it. She had done this 7 times before Thatcher arrived. She would do it again. What remained as the decade closed and the 1990s opened was the sense, not spoken because she did not speak such things, but present nonetheless in the careful observation of those who watched her closely, that the years just past had been among the most testing of her reign. Not because of the politics, which she had navigated with her customary skill, but because of the family, because of Diana and Charles, and the unhappy marriage, whose unhappiness was becoming less and less a private matter and more a public spectacle, consuming the oxygen that the monarchy needed to sustain itself, and producing in its place a heat that was very difficult to control. The hard years were not behind her. They were ahead. Chapter 7, The Broken Years, Annus Horribilis and Diana, 1992 to 1997. There are years that pass quietly, leaving little mark upon the people who lived through them, their days accumulating in the ordinary fashion of time, one after another, unremarkable, their small difficulties and small pleasures roughly in balance. And then there are years of a different kind entirely. Years that arrive with violence, and refuse to leave until they have taken something from you that you cannot get back. For Elizabeth, 1992 was such a year. She had been queen for 40 years. 40 years of the weekly audiences, and the state visits, and the Commonwealth tours and the Christmas broadcasts, and the trooping of the colour and the opening of Parliament. 40 years of the unbroken, unhurrying rhythm of duty, performed with a consistency that had become, in the minds of the British people, something almost geological in its solidity. She was by 1992 no longer simply a person. She was a fact of British life, a constant in the landscape, as reliable and as apparently immovable as the institutions she embodied. The crown endures. The Queen remains. Whatever else might change, and so much had changed in 40 years, that at least was fixed. And then 1992 arrived, and it was not fixed. It began with the marriages. The House of Windsor had produced in the previous decade a proliferation of royal weddings that had given the public moments of genuine pageantry. Charles and Diana in 81, Andrew and Sarah Ferguson in 86, and Anne and Mark Phillips somewhat earlier in 73. These were the public occasions, the golden set pieces. What the public had not seen, and what the palace had worked hard to prevent the public from seeing, was what the marriages had become behind the ceremony, the private geography of 4 unions that were, in varying degrees and for varying reasons, failing. In January of 1992, it became public that Andrew, Duke of York, and Sarah Ferguson were to separate. The announcement was managed as carefully as such announcements can be, but no amount of careful management can prevent a royal separation from becoming immediate front-page news, and immediate front-page news, in the tabloid culture of the early 90s, meant photographs and speculation, and the relentless forensic examination of every available detail of the private lives involved. Sarah Ferguson had always been a difficult figure for the palace to manage. Vivid and ungoverned in a way that the institution found fundamentally uncongenial, and the breakdown of her marriage opened a chapter of revelations whose contents would cause considerable embarrassment in the months that followed. In April, Princess Anne, the Queen's only daughter, the hardest working and least celebrated of the royal children, was divorced from Mark Phillips, the equestrian with whom she had made a marriage that had visibly frayed over many years, conducted with the stoic privacy that was Anne's characteristic mode of managing all personal difficulty. The divorce was handled with minimal drama, which was the best that could be said of it, and Anne would remarry later that year, quietly, without fuss, the naval officer Timothy Lawrence. It was the right outcome, managed in the right way, and the public received it with the reasonable equanimity of people who have been married and divorced themselves, and who understand that not all marriages work. But it was Charles and Diana who occupied the center of the unraveling. The marriage had been deteriorating for years, not quietly, not privately, but in the full and brutal glare of a media environment that had identified the Princess of Wales as the most compelling human story of the era, and had pursued that story with an intensity that bore comparison in its relentlessness and its intrusiveness with obsession. The British tabloids had been running Diana stories for a decade. Her clothes, her friendships, her emotional state, her relationship with her husband, her relationship with the palace, her relationship with the public, all of it had been scrutinized, speculated about, and retailed to a readership whose appetite for more showed no sign of diminishing. In June of 1992, Andrew Morton's biography of Diana was published. It was in its way an extraordinary document, not for its prose, which was functional, but for its content, which was devastating. Diana had, in secret, provided Morton with recordings of her own voice, speaking candidly about the most private dimensions of her marriage and her life within the royal family. Her unhappiness was total, and had been total for many years. She spoke of Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles. She spoke of her own struggles with bulimia. She spoke of feeling isolated, unsupported, trapped in an institution that did not understand her and did not try to. She spoke with a directness that the palace had never heard from within its own walls, at least not in a form that reached the general public, and the effect was seismic. The palace's response was the response of an institution that has not yet understood, that the ground has changed beneath it. Stiff, defensive, operating on the assumption that dignity and discretion, properly maintained, will be sufficient to see the crisis through. They would not be sufficient. The ground had changed. The rules of the game, in the age of the Morton biography, and the satellite television, and the 24-hour news cycle, were not the rules that the palace had been built to play by. In December of 1992, the Prime Minister John Major stood up in the House of Commons and announced that the Prince and Princess of Wales were to separate. It was a separation, he was careful to say, with no constitutional implications. The princess would continue to be regarded as a member of the royal family. The separation would not affect the succession. The words were as controlled as the words of a man who has practiced them in front of a mirror, and they conveyed precisely the information they were intended to convey, and nothing more. But something more had already been conveyed, and had been conveying itself for months, and would continue to convey itself long after the formal announcement in the House of Commons. The heir to the throne's marriage had failed. The fairy tale, which had been one of the most watched events in the history of television, had turned out to be something other than a fairy tale. The institution of the monarchy, which rests in part on the public's willingness to invest the ordinary human events of the royal family, births, marriages, deaths, with a significance beyond the ordinary, had found that investment turning in the hands of a grieving and bewildered public into something more complicated than admiration. And then, on the 20th of November, which happened to be the 45th anniversary of the Queen and Prince Philip's wedding, Windsor Castle caught fire. The fire began in the Queen's private chapel in the northeast wing, from a spotlight that had been placed too close to a curtain during restoration work. It was a Thursday morning, and the castle was in the middle of a program of works that had removed many of its valuable contents to safety. The paintings and the furniture and the irreplaceable objects of centuries had largely been moved. But the fire spread with extraordinary speed through the Victorian additions to the castle's fabric, consuming rooms that had stood for 150 years, and the images that appeared on the evening news, the great towers of Windsor wrapped in smoke, the orange glow of the fire against the November sky, were images of something that felt to those who watched like more than a building burning. It felt like a metaphor. The year had provided too many disasters for the final one to be seen as merely accidental. The Queen arrived at Windsor and stood in her headscarf and her waterproof coat and watched her home burn, and the photographs of that moment, this woman in her mid-60s, standing in the cold November air watching the flames, captured something that all the formal portraits and the state photographs and the carefully managed official images of 40 years had not quite captured. Here was someone suffering. Here was a human being in a moment of genuine loss, standing in the November wind, with the same capacity for pain that any of the people watching her on their television screens possessed. She had already, earlier that year, accepted a position that had been negotiated for some time, but whose announcement now fell into the context of 1992, with a particular resonance. She would begin paying income tax. The sovereign's exemption from income tax, a historic privilege that had its origins in the medieval understanding that the crown and the state were essentially one, and that taxing the monarch was therefore a circular exercise, was to end. She would also begin contributing to the costs of certain members of the royal family, removing them from the civil list and placing them in effect on the family's own resources. And Buckingham Palace would be open to the public during the summer months, its admission fees directed toward the costs of repairing Windsor. These were significant concessions. They were made, it must be said, not entirely without external pressure. The scrutiny of the monarchy's finances had intensified through the year, and the question of why the public should fund the repair of a castle belonging to the wealthiest family in the country was being asked with increasing sharpness in newspapers and in Parliament. But the concessions were also, in their way, characteristic of Elizabeth's approach to the great institutional questions of her reign, the willingness, when the pressure of public feeling was genuine and the criticism was legitimate, to adapt. Not to capitulate, not to abandon the essential character of the institution, but to recognize that the monarchy's long-term health required it to be seen as proportionate, as aware of its own privileges, as responsive to the expectations of a democratic society. At the Guildhall, at a lunch held to mark the 40th anniversary of her accession, she gave a speech. It was unusual among her public addresses in its personal register. She was not, as a rule, a speaker who allowed her private experience to surface in her public words, but this speech departed from the customary. She acknowledged that 1992 was not a year she would look back on with undiluted pleasure. She used the phrase, she spoke it in Latin with a self-deprecating acknowledgement that it was not her own coinage but that it suited the case, annus horribilis. Horrible year. The phrase was passed immediately to the press, and it entered the language permanently, becoming one of those expressions so perfectly fitted to its moment that it ceases to belong to the person who said it, and becomes instead a possession of the culture. She looked tired at the Guildhall lunch. She was recovering from a cold that had settled on her voice, and her delivery was slightly roughened by it, and perhaps also by everything else. She was 66 years old, and she had been managing the worst year of her reign, and the composure she maintained was real, but it was not without cost, and the Guildhall speech gave the public the briefest, most controlled glimpse of what that cost might be. The years that followed were years of managed crisis, the Charles and Diana situation evolving in public in real time, with both parties making decisions about how much to say, and to whom that had consequences none of them fully anticipated. In November of 1995, Diana gave an interview to the BBC journalist Martin Bashir, on the program Panorama. It was watched by 23 million people in the United Kingdom alone. She spoke with the directness that had always been her instinct and the palace's nightmare, about the marriage, about Charles, about Camilla, about her own sense of fitness to be queen, about the future of the monarchy. She said of the question of whether Charles should be king, that she thought the British people needed someone who could give them love, and that she herself would like to be a queen of people's hearts. She said these things with her eyes very wide and her voice very steady, and 23 million people believed her because she looked, as she almost always looked, like someone telling the truth. The Queen, who had been patient with the situation beyond what many might have managed, moved decisively. In December of 1995, she wrote personally to Charles and to Diana, advising them that an early divorce was in the best interests of everyone concerned. The letter was private, but its existence became known, because in the world that the marriage of Charles and Diana had created, nothing remained private for long. The divorce was concluded in August of 1996. Diana retained the title Princess of Wales, but was stripped of the style Her Royal Highness, a decision that Diana received with the public hurt that she had learned to deploy with great effectiveness, and that the palace managed with the usual mixture of procedural correctness and human incomprehension of how it would appear. She was 35 years old. She was, in the estimation of millions of people in Britain and around the world, the most famous woman on the planet. She was also, in the late summer of 1996, alone in a way that she had not perhaps entirely anticipated, outside the institution, stripped of its protections and its protocols, navigating the extraordinary exposure of her position without the framework that the royal family, for all its coldness toward her, had at least provided. On the 31st of August 1997, in a tunnel beneath the Pont de l'Alma in Paris, a car carrying Diana, Princess of Wales, crashed into a pillar at high speed, pursued by photographers on motorcycles. She died in the early hours of the morning, in the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital. She was 36 years old. The Queen was at Balmoral when the news came. She was woken by Philip, who had been told by one of the household, and she received the news in the dark of the Scottish night, with whatever it is that Elizabeth receives the worst news with, that interior stillness that those around her have described but never quite explained, the gathering of resources that precedes the management of catastrophe. Her immediate concern, those around her have consistently reported, was for the two boys, for William, who was 15, and Harry, who was 12, who were sleeping in rooms nearby and who would need to be told by dawn that their mother was dead. She decided to stay at Balmoral. It was the right decision by one measure, the measure of a grandmother who has two grandchildren in acute shock and grief, and who believes that what they need, in the immediate hours after the worst news of their lives, is consistency and presence and the sheltering familiarity of a place they know and love. It was also by another measure, a decision that would prove in the extraordinary days that followed, deeply costly. Because Britain was grieving. Britain was grieving in a way that nobody had predicted, and that nobody, in the first hours of the news, entirely understood. The flowers began appearing outside Kensington Palace on the morning of the 31st, first a few, carried by people who had come spontaneously, who had no particular plan except the human impulse to mark a loss with something living. Within hours there were thousands of bouquets. Within days there was a carpet of flowers that extended from the palace gates outward into the surrounding streets. Acres of flowers and cards and teddy bears and photographs. A spontaneous memorial on a scale that Britain had never seen, and that those who observed it found both moving and faintly disquieting in its intensity. The grief was real. But it was also performing itself, and the performance had a quality that those schooled in the English tradition of contained sorrow found difficult to read. This was not the stiff-lipped endurance of the Blitz. This was something imported from a different emotional culture, demonstrative, public, requiring acknowledgement, requiring response. The people who left flowers outside Kensington Palace were not doing so quietly. They were doing so loudly, and they were looking with increasing impatience as the days passed, toward the palace, the other palace, the central one, Buckingham Palace, and what they saw troubled them. The flagpole was bare. It was customary at Buckingham Palace to fly the royal standard, the flag of the sovereign, when the monarch was in residence, and no flag at all when she was absent. There was no flag for Diana, because Diana was no longer a member of the royal family in the formal sense, and the Union flag was not flown at the palace by tradition. But the public, looking at the bare flagpole in the days after Diana's death, did not read constitutional convention. They read indifference. They read the palace as cold and absent, the Queen as remote and unfeeling, the institution as more concerned with its own protocols than with the human catastrophe that had just occurred. The newspapers, sensing the public mood with the accuracy of long practice, turned. The tabloids that had chronicled the royal family for decades, that had made fortunes from the story of Diana, that had contributed in their pursuit of photographs to the conditions that had led to the crash in the Paris tunnel, now turned their enormously powerful apparatus of public sentiment toward a different target. Why was the Queen not here? Why was the flag not flying? Why had she said nothing? Inside the palace, the communication machinery struggled to respond to something it had not been built for. The Queen's instinct, to remain with her grandsons, to shield them from the storm, to maintain the private space of grief against the intrusion of public performance, was the instinct of a grandmother, and it was as a human instinct entirely defensible. But the monarchy is not merely a family. It is a public institution, and its relationship with the public is mediated by visible acts and visible presences, and in the absence of both, the public began to fill the space with its own interpretation. The pressure built. Advisors urged action. The government, Tony Blair's Labour administration, newly elected in May and acutely sensitive to public mood, communicated its concerns with the careful urgency of people who understand that the situation is deteriorating. Blair himself had set the tone in his statement on the morning of Diana's death, describing her as the people's princess in a phrase whose emotional precision left the palace's own communications looking by comparison stiff and inadequate. On the 5th of September, 6 days after Diana's death, and the day before the funeral, the Queen returned to London. She stopped her car outside Buckingham Palace and stepped out to look at the flowers, the extraordinary mountain of flowers, now filling the entire forecourt and spilling beyond the gates into the mall. She walked along the barrier and accepted the flowers that people pressed into her hands, and spoke to people in the crowd and received from the faces before her the grief that the country was carrying. The flag was raised, the Union flag, flown at half-mast at Buckingham Palace for the first time in the institution's history. Another first, another departure from precedent, another acknowledgement that the ground had changed and that the old rules could not simply be imposed upon a world that had moved beyond them. That evening, she gave a live television address. She spoke from Buckingham Palace, with the crowds and the flowers visible through the windows behind her. She spoke as a grandmother, she said, as a grandmother and as a queen. She paid tribute to Diana. She called her an exceptional and gifted human being. She said that in good times and bad, she had never lost her capacity to smile and laugh, to inspire others with her warmth and kindness. She said that she admired and respected her for her energy and commitment to others, and especially for her devotion to her 2 boys. She said that those of us who knew Diana will grieve in a particular way, and that those who never met her but felt they knew her will mourn her loss too. She spoke for 4 minutes. Her voice was controlled, as it always was, but there was something in it, a quality of effort, of words costing something to say, that those who watched her understood. She was not performing grief. She was managing it, in the only way available to her, in the way she had always managed everything that was most difficult, which was to find the words and say them clearly and stand very still and not look away. The funeral of Diana, Princess of Wales, took place on the 6th of September at Westminster Abbey, the same abbey in which Diana had been married 16 years earlier, in the ceremony that 1 billion people had watched with such uncomplicated joy. The cortege that carried her coffin through the London streets passed through a silence so profound that the sound of horses' hooves was audible to those standing at the edge of the crowd. People wept openly. Men wept, which in Britain requires particular note, because men weeping in public is not, in the English tradition, a common sight, and its frequency on that September morning was an index of how genuinely, how deeply the loss had been felt. The Queen stood on the steps of the Abbey as the coffin passed. She did something she had never done before in public. She bowed her head as the coffin went by. It was a gesture of extraordinary significance for a woman who was, constitutionally and in the deepest sense, the person to whom everyone else bowed. She bowed to Diana. The cameras recorded it. The moment entered history. In the years that bracketed Diana's death, the Queen's international role had provided a counterpoint to the domestic turbulence, a reminder that the institution, whatever its internal difficulties, still carried a significance in the world that no amount of tabloid crisis could entirely diminish. In 1994, she had made a state visit to Russia, the first by a British monarch since the Revolution of 1917. Since the world in which her great-uncle Tsar Nicholas II and her grandfather King George V had been contemporaries and cousins had been swept away by history's most violent tide. She arrived in Moscow and was received by Boris Yeltsin, the first democratically elected leader of Russia, in the Kremlin, that building which had been for the entirety of her reign the symbolic fortress of an adversarial power, and which now offered in the uncertain morning of the post-Soviet world a tentative hand of something approaching reconciliation. She had stood in the Kremlin staterooms and accepted the reality that the Cold War that had framed her entire reign, that had been the geopolitical context within which every decision of her 42 years on the throne had been made, was over. The world it had produced, with all its terrifying certainties, was over. What came next was not yet clear. But she was there, in Moscow, in the Kremlin, representing the continuity of a country that had also changed enormously, but that had held through the changes to something that she herself embodied, the idea that institutions, maintained with sufficient seriousness and sufficient care, can outlast almost anything. The peoples of the Commonwealth had always seen her in their own particular light, refracted through the lens of their own cultures and languages and histories. In Canada, the First Nations peoples had given her a title of their own devising, Mother of All Peoples, a designation that carried within it the long and complicated history of the relationship between the indigenous nations of the continent and the Crown that had over centuries both protected and failed them. In Papua New Guinea she was Mrs. Quinn or Mama Quinn, the Tok Pisin rendering of her title, carrying in its simplicity an affection that formal honorifics could not quite replicate. The Maori people of New Zealand called her Te Kotuku Riranga Tahi, the white heron of single flight, a phrase from the natural world of the Pacific, describing the rare white heron that is seen only once, an image of singular and unrepeatable grace. In Jamaica she was Mrs. Queen, in the warm directness of patois. In South Africa, before and after the long rupture of apartheid, she was Matlalapula, the rain queen, the one who brings life-giving water to dry land. Each of these names said something about what Elizabeth meant to the peoples who had given it, something that the formal title of Queen Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and of her other realms and territories, Queen, Head of the Commonwealth, Defender of the Faith, could not quite contain. The formal title described her position. The names that peoples had given her in their own languages described something else, something more felt, more personal, more mysterious. The quality in her that the world had recognized and had tried, in a dozen languages and a dozen cultural registers, to find the words for. She was, after 1997, an older woman, 61 years old, her hair fully white now, her face carrying the lines of a life lived entirely in public view. She had been through the worst year of the war, and the worst year of her reign, and the death of the most complicated figure her family had produced in the modern era. She had bowed her head on the steps of Westminster Abbey to a woman she had not always understood, who had not always understood her, who had died in a Paris tunnel at 36 while the cameras chased her. She had said what needed to be said. She had returned when returning was required. She had adapted again, because adapting was what survival required, and survival was what she had always, in the end, chosen. The new century was approaching. She would meet it as she had met everything else, upright, composed, and present. Chapter 8. A Modern Restoration into the New Millennium, 1998 to 2011. The turn of the millennium arrived with less drama than the world had anticipated, and considerably more relief. The computers did not fail. The aeroplanes did not fall from the sky. The banking systems continued to process their transactions with the silent, reliable competence that the modern world had constructed its daily existence upon. In London, the fireworks above the Thames were spectacular, and the crowds were enormous, and the bells of the churches rang in the new year and the new century and the new millennium, with the accumulated weight of all the things that bells rung at such moments are understood to signify: continuity, renewal, the persistence of the human capacity for celebration in the face of everything that conspires against it. Elizabeth had seen in the new year quietly, as she almost always saw in the new year, not in the public manner, not at a party or a gathering designed for maximum visibility, but with the understated domesticity that was, for all the grandeur of her position, her natural register. She was 73 years old. She had been queen for 48 years. She had outlasted in the course of those years the certainties of the Cold War and the structures of empire, and the marriages of 3 of her 4 children, and the life of the most famous woman in the world, who had been her daughter-in-law. She had watched the century that had made her, the century of the 2 world wars and the atom bomb and the television and the welfare state and the decolonization and the internet, close behind her, and she had turned to face whatever came next with the posture she had always maintained, which was the posture of someone who does not require the future to announce itself in advance. What came next, in the years immediately following the millennium, was something that surprised even those who had studied the monarchy with the closest attention. The public mood shifted. It shifted not dramatically, not in a single decisive moment, but gradually and then in certain respects quite suddenly, the way that the light shifts in the late afternoon, imperceptibly for a long time and then all at once present in a quality it did not have an hour before. The institution that had seemed, in the terrible aftermath of 1997, to be in genuine danger of losing the public confidence upon which its existence depended, that institution was finding its footing again. And the woman at its center was finding something else, a quality of public affection that was different from what had preceded it, warmer and less complicated, freed from the competitive narrative of Diana and the tabloid wars of the 1980s and 90s, settled into something more like the feeling one has for a person who has simply, reliably been there. She had become, in the estimation of the British public, something like a national grandmother. The phrase was not one she would ever have used herself. She did not deal in such categories, and she would have found its informality faintly alarming, but it captured something real about the change in her relationship with the people. The grandmother is not worshipped. The grandmother is not placed on a pedestal, at the necessary remove of reverence. The grandmother is loved in the particular way of someone who has been present through all the difficult passages, who has held the family together through the storms, who has not left and has not complained and has simply steadily continued. Britain looked at Elizabeth in the early years of the new century, and saw someone who had been there for as long as most of them could remember, who had been there for all of it. And the recognition produced in them a feeling that was not so much admiration as gratitude, which is a deeper and more durable emotion. The year 2002 brought, with the Golden Jubilee, a confirmation of this. But before the Jubilee, the year brought grief. Princess Margaret, the Queen's younger sister, the vivid, difficult, extraordinary woman who had been Elizabeth's companion since childhood, who had been the other half of We Four, who had been the one who filled the room with color and sound while Elizabeth held its center with a quieter authority, died on the 9th of February 2002. She had been ill for some time, her health eroded by a series of strokes, and by the long accumulated toll of a life lived in its private dimensions with considerable intensity. She was 71 years old. She died at King Edward VII's Hospital in London, and the death was peaceful, and it was not unexpected, and none of that made it easier. 6 weeks later, on the 30th of March, the Queen Mother died. She was 101 years old, an age so remarkable that the news of her death, when it came, was received with a kind of wonder as much as sorrow. She had been the last survivor of the world into which Elizabeth had been born, the world of Edwardian certainties and imperial confidence, and the particular social structures that the First War had begun to dismantle and the Second had finished. She had been a constant presence in her daughter's life, supportive in the warm, undemanding way of a woman who understands that the person she loves must be free to carry her burden in her own way. She had been popular, enormously and genuinely popular, with the British public, who had watched her husband's quiet courage during the war and attributed to her, not without justification, a significant share of its inspiration. Elizabeth lost her sister and her mother in the same year. She lost them both in the late winter and early spring, before the Jubilee celebrations had begun, and she carried the grief of it, publicly, privately, in the particular way she always carried the things that cost her most, which was without display, without the vocabulary of suffering, with the forward-facing composure that had been her mode of being for 76 years. And then she went on. The Golden Jubilee was celebrated across the United Kingdom in June of 2002 with a warmth and an enthusiasm that, given the turbulence of the preceding decade, was not entirely taken for granted by those who organized it. They had wondered, the planners and the palace officials and the government ministers, whether the public would come. The public came. The central celebrations in London were spread across a long weekend at the beginning of June, and they combined the ceremonial and the contemporary in a manner that suggested someone had been paying attention to the lessons of the previous decade. There was a classical concert in the gardens of Buckingham Palace, attended by 12,000 people, an audience of the kind that had never before been gathered within the palace's historic walls. There was a pop concert on the following night, on the forecourt of the palace itself, in which the great figures of British popular music performed on a stage erected in front of the building that had always been, in the public imagination, the most formal and unapproachable of royal residences. The image of the guitarist Brian May standing on the roof of Buckingham Palace, playing the national anthem, was one of those images that fixes itself in memory precisely because of its unlikeliness. The fortress of tradition as a concert venue, the anthem of the monarchy played on an electric guitar, the very improbability of the combination being its own statement about what the institution was becoming. She watched the pop concert with visible enjoyment. She tapped her foot. Those who saw her do so found it, depending on their disposition, either charming or mildly surreal. And the truth was that it was both simultaneously, which is often the nature of the most revealing royal moments. The procession through London on the 3rd of June was watched by 1 million people in the capital and by many millions more on television. The Golden Coach, the same Baroque vehicle that had carried her to her coronation almost exactly 50 years before, moved through streets that had been lined since before dawn by people who had come to be part of something that they understood was significant in the way that certain historical moments simply are, not political, not abstract, but human. They were there to see a woman who had been their queen for half a century, who had been present in their lives as a constant reference point, and to mark, through their presence on the street, the fact that they valued what she had given them. She stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace and looked out at the crowd below, and the crowd below looked back at her, and whatever was exchanged between them in that long gaze across the forecourt, whatever compact between sovereign and people was renewed in the shared experience of that afternoon, it held. The monarchy had not merely survived the previous decade. It had, in some measure that was difficult to quantify, but impossible to miss, recovered. The daily work of the reign continued through the years of the new century, with the same unvarying rhythm that had characterized it since the beginning. Every day, wherever she was, at Buckingham Palace, at Windsor, at Sandringham, at Balmoral, on tour abroad, the red boxes arrived. The red boxes were the physical containers of the constitutional relationship between the sovereign and her government, leather-bound, the royal cipher embossed upon them, locked with a key that only she possessed. Inside them, State papers, Foreign Office telegrams, cabinet conclusions, the correspondence of her prime ministers, the reports of her ambassadors, the legislation that required the royal assent. She read them all. This was not performed diligence. This was not the careful choreography of an institution maintaining an image. She read the papers because she believed, with a conviction that never appeared to have weakened across the decades, that she was required to be informed, that the constitutional role she occupied could not be discharged with integrity unless she understood what her government was doing and why, that the right to be consulted, to encourage, to warn, Bagheho's 3 rights, memorized in the schoolroom at Royal Lodge, applied in the audiences at Buckingham Palace, had value only if they were exercised from a foundation of genuine knowledge. She had, by the time of the new century, served under 10 prime ministers. She had with each of them maintained the weekly audience, the private conversation, the constitutional relationship that was the living heart of the British system of government. She had agreed with some more than others. She had found some more congenial than others. She had warned some more urgently than others. But she had served all of them with the same scrupulous neutrality, the same professional commitment to the constitutional framework within which the monarchy operated, the same absolute refusal to allow her personal preferences, and she had them, she was human, she had preferences, to contaminate the public record. Tony Blair had been the prime minister she had worked with through the late 1990s and into the new century, and their relationship had been, by the available evidence, one of mutual wariness carefully managed into mutual respect. Blair's government had modernized the monarchy in ways that were not always comfortable: the Freedom of Information Act, the Human Rights Act, the devolution of powers to Scotland and Wales, all of which had implications for the institution and its relationship with the state. She had adapted, as she always adapted, without complaint and without obvious reluctance, understanding that the duty of the Crown is to serve the constitutional arrangements as they exist, not to preserve them in the form she might have preferred. Gordon Brown, who succeeded Blair in June of 2007, was a man of considerable intellectual seriousness and considerable emotional complexity, and his premiership, overtaken almost immediately by the financial crisis of 2008, was one of the most pressured of the period. The crisis, the collapse of the banking system, the global recession that followed, the extraordinary government interventions required to prevent something worse, was the most significant economic event of Elizabeth's reign since the crises of the 1970s, and it reshaped the political landscape in ways that were still being worked through when Brown left office in 2010. She had visited the London School of Economics in November of 2008, shortly after the crisis began, and she had asked, with the directness for which she was quietly famous in private encounters, why no one had seen it coming. The question, delivered to a room full of economists and financial specialists who had spent their careers in precisely the fields that had failed to predict the catastrophe, was both simple and devastating, and it became, in the reporting that followed, one of those moments in which the apparently naive question of someone who has not been captured by the professional consensus of a field turns out to be the most penetrating question available. No one had a satisfying answer. The economists present had the grace to acknowledge as much. David Cameron, who took office in May of 2010 as the leader of a coalition government, the first such arrangement since the wartime national government, was the 12th prime minister of her reign. He was 43 years old when he entered Downing Street. Elizabeth was 84. She had been queen for 58 years. The generational gap between them was vast, and it was not lost on observers that the prime minister, in the year of his birth, had been served by a queen who was already in the middle of her reign and already a figure of settled historical significance. It was under Cameron's government that one of the most significant international events of the new millennium's first decade was planned and executed. The state visit to the Republic of Ireland in May of 2011 was unlike any other royal engagement of the era, not in its protocol, which followed the established forms of such visits, but in its historical and emotional weight, which was unlike anything the Queen had undertaken since the Russia visit of 1994. No British monarch had visited the independent Irish state since its foundation. George V had visited Ireland in 1911, but that was a visit to the island of Ireland when it was still part of the United Kingdom, before the War of Independence, before the partition, before the decades of troubled relationship between the two nations that had culminated in the 30 years of conflict in Northern Ireland, known simply, with the English talent for understatement in the face of horror, as the Troubles. The Troubles had officially ended with the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, but the peace was new and still tender, and the wounds of the preceding centuries, the centuries of conquest and famine and rebellion and partition and conflict, were not the kind that close quickly. She arrived in Dublin on the 17th of May, 2011. The security was extraordinary, the most elaborate for any visit to Ireland in living memory, the city centre locked down, the streets quiet in the particular way of streets that have been secured rather than deserted, the helicopters visible above the rooftops. There had been threats. There had been a viable bomb found along the planned route of the motorcade. The Irish police and their British counterparts had worked for months to ensure that the visit would pass without incident, and their work held. She went first to the Garden of Remembrance in Parnell Square, the garden built to honor those who had died in the cause of Irish freedom, which was to say, in part, those who had died in conflict with the British state that she represented. She laid a wreath, and then she bowed her head. It was a moment of extraordinary symbolic power, precisely because it was not required. No protocol demanded that the Queen of the United Kingdom bow her head at a memorial to those who had fought and died against British rule. The bow was a choice, a deliberate, considered act of acknowledgement, made by a woman who understood, with the full weight of 85 years and 60 years of sovereignty, what it meant and what it cost and why it was the right thing to do. At Dublin Castle that evening, Dublin Castle, which had been for centuries the seat of British rule in Ireland, the physical embodiment of the colonial relationship that had defined the two nations' history, she gave a speech. She began it in Irish. Tá éideas orm a bith in Éireann Áras. It is a pleasure to be in Ireland again. 7 words, delivered in a language she did not speak, learned phonetically, offered as a gesture whose significance was entirely in the gesture itself, in the acknowledgement that the language existed and had been suppressed and had survived and deserved at this moment in particular, the courtesy of being heard in the first words of the British sovereign's address. The room was silent when she spoke those words. The Irish dignitaries and officials and guests who heard them understood immediately what was being offered, not a policy, not a diplomatic formula, not a carefully negotiated concession. Something more personal. An acknowledgement. The concession of respect from someone who did not have to concede it, and who had chosen to. She spoke of the troubled history between the two nations. She spoke of the things that had been done on both sides that could never be undone. She said with a careful and significant precision that with the benefit of hindsight we can all see things we would wish had been done differently or not at all. The passive construction was deliberate. She was not confessing to specific crimes, which would have been constitutionally and historically problematic, but she was acknowledging in a manner that the Irish audience received as genuine that wrongs had been committed and that they were not forgotten. The visit lasted 4 days. She went to the Guinness storehouse at St. James's Gate and pulled a pint of Guinness and held the glass and smiled the smile of someone who has been photographed more times than can be counted and who can still, on the right occasion, find genuine amusement in the situation. She went to the Irish National Stud in Kildare, where she stood among the horses with the ease of a woman in entirely natural surroundings. She met members of the Irish public and received from them the warmth of people who have made a deliberate choice to extend welcome, a warmth that has a particular quality because it is chosen rather than assumed. She left Ireland on the 20th of May, and those who had watched the visit, in both countries and beyond, understood that something had been accomplished. Not the resolution of history, which cannot be resolved, only lived with, but the acknowledgement of it, made with sufficient seriousness and sufficient grace to constitute something real. A statement from an old institution, through the person who embodied it, that the past was known and regretted, and that the present offered something different. Her patronage of charities, more than 500 organizations, ranging from the great international conservation bodies to the smallest local hospices and community groups, was a dimension of her working life that received less attention than the state visits and the constitutional crises, but that was in its accumulated effect of enormous practical consequence. An organization that gained the Queen's patronage gained something that no advertising campaign could purchase, and no endorsement by any other public figure could quite replicate. The signal transmitted through the connection with the crown that the work being done was valued at the highest level of the state. Charitable fundraising campaigns, when associated with the royal warrant, raised more money. Awareness of causes, when championed by the sovereign, penetrated further into public consciousness. She attended the events, read the briefings, engaged with the people doing the work, and did so consistently, year after year, in the way that separates a genuine patron from a nominal one. The charities themselves ranged so widely as to defy easy characterization. This was deliberate, a reflection of the constitutional requirement that the crown belong to everyone and be seen to serve every legitimate interest within the national life. She was patron of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, and the World Wildlife Fund, and the Royal Horticultural Society, and the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and hundreds of other bodies whose activities touch the full spectrum of British civic and cultural life. She was also patron of organizations in each of the realms and Commonwealth countries. The reach of her charitable engagement was, like the reach of her diplomatic role, genuinely global. Through all of these years, the red boxes had continued to arrive. In the years since the accession, by any reasonable calculation, she had read more government papers than any other living person, had followed the course of British policy with a continuity of attention that no minister, no civil servant, no journalist could match, because ministers and civil servants and journalists came and went while she remained. She had been present at the beginning of the National Health Service, and the end of the British Empire, and the creation of the welfare state, and the rise of the Internet, and the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the beginning and the end of the Cold War. She had read the papers on all of it. She had asked the questions and received the answers, and stored the information in the remarkable memory that those who briefed her consistently remarked upon, the ability to recall, years later, the detail of a briefing long since consigned by its author to the archive. There are prime ministers who have admitted, in the reflective privacy of their memoirs, that the weekly audience at Buckingham Palace was the most unusual and the most valuable conversation of their working week. Unusual, because it was entirely confidential, which meant that nothing needed to be performed, no position needed to be maintained for the benefit of a record. Valuable because the person across the table had been receiving these briefings, and asking these questions, and applying this accumulated knowledge for longer than any of them had been in political life. She knew more about the British Constitution, and about the history of the British government, than virtually anyone alive. She had seen how it worked from the center of the system, continuously for 60 years. She had watched governments rise and fall and rise again, had watched policies made and unmade, had watched the arc of events bend in directions that no one had predicted, and had witnessed again and again the gap between what governments intended and what they accomplished. She never said publicly what she thought about any of it. The constitutional obligation was absolute, and she honored it absolutely. But the knowledge was there, in the steady gray eyes, in the careful questions, in the slight shift of expression that those who knew her well had learned to read as the signal that she had noticed something that was not being said. The knowledge was there, and it was by any measure extraordinary. The new millennium had not made her younger, but it had made her in a certain sense clearer, more distilled, more purely herself. The things that had always been true about her were more visible now, stripped of the surrounding noise of the crises and the controversies that had dominated the middle decades of her reign. The composure, the commitment, the faith, the humor, dry and quick and entirely unpredictable in its targets, the love of horses and dogs and the Scottish countryside, and the simple, uncomplicated pleasures of a life lived outdoors. The belief never stated as a belief, because she did not deal in statements of belief, but enacted daily in everything she did, that the duty she had been given was worth the full investment of everything she had. She was 85 years old when she returned from Ireland, in the warm May of 2011. She had been queen for 59 years. She had a diamond jubilee approaching, and a nation that was, by all available evidence, very glad she was still there. She had more to give. She knew it, and she intended to give it. Chapter 9, The Global Icon, Diamond and Platinum Milestones 2012 to 2020. There is a film, lasting approximately 4 minutes, that was shown to 80,000 people inside the Olympic Stadium in Stratford on the evening of the 27th of July, 2012, and to a global television audience estimated at nearly 1 billion. In it, a man in a dinner jacket, the actor Daniel Craig, playing the character he had made his own in the Bond films, arrives at Buckingham Palace, is escorted through its corridors by a pair of corgis, and is admitted to the private study of the Queen of the United Kingdom. She turns from her desk. She says without expression, "Good evening, Mr. Bond." They walk together to a helicopter waiting on the palace lawn. They fly over London, above the Thames, above the landmarks of the capital, and then they jump. Two figures in evening dress falling through the summer sky toward the stadium below. And then the real Elizabeth appeared, walking into the stadium in the flesh, in a salmon-pink dress, to take her place in the royal box for the opening ceremony of the London Olympic Games. The crowd inside the stadium, which had been watching the film in the state of escalating incredulity that only a very well-executed surprise can produce, received her with a roar that conveyed, beyond the ordinary registers of welcome and applause, something close to delight. Because it was delightful. It was genuinely, unexpectedly, improbably delightful. The 86-year-old Queen of England playing along with a spoof action film, delivering a deadpan line to James Bond, jumping from a helicopter over East London in what was of course a representation performed by stunt doubles, but whose effect was entirely in the game she had agreed to play. She had agreed to this. She had sat at her desk, and she had delivered her line to Daniel Craig with the composure that she brought to everything. And she had understood, with the quick intelligence that those around her had always known was there beneath the formal exterior, exactly what the film required of her and exactly how to give it. It was, in retrospect, one of the moments that defined how the public would come to understand the final chapter of her reign, not merely as the solemn continuation of an ancient institution, but as the performance of something genuinely more complex, a sovereignty that had learned across 60 years to hold the ceremonial and the human in the same hand without dropping either. The Diamond Jubilee of 2012 was the formal occasion for the celebration of 60 years since the February morning at Heathrow Airport, when the young woman in black had descended from the aircraft and become, in the meeting of foot and tarmac, something more than herself. It was by any measure an extraordinary span. 6 decades of continuous sovereign service. 6 decades of the weekly audiences, the red boxes, the Commonwealth tours, the Christmas broadcasts, the openings of Parliament and the troopings of the colour, and the endless, unrelenting rhythm of duty discharged without pause and without complaint. The country wanted to mark it, and it did. The Central Thames pageant on the 3rd of June was one of the most remarkable spectacles London had produced in living memory. A flotilla of over 1,000 boats moving along the river in the rain, because it rained, because it always rains, because England and reliable summer weather have never been more than passing acquaintances. She stood on the deck of the royal barge Spirit of Chartwell for 4 hours in the rain and the cold, without sitting, without retreating, without the smallest visible concession to the discomfort that 4 hours in cold rain represents for any person, let alone an 86-year-old woman. She stood and watched the flotilla pass, and waved at the crowds on the banks, and received from them the noise of genuine, unfeigned affection. Philip was unwell. He had been taken to hospital with a bladder infection and had missed the afternoon's events, and would spend the remainder of the Jubilee celebrations away from the public program, resting. She carried the public obligations alone, which was not, in the long calculation of the reign, an unfamiliar position. She had always in the end carried them alone, even with Philip beside her. Even in the decades of their marriage, the weight of the sovereign's role had been and could only be hers. But his absence in those Jubilee days was a visible reminder of the vulnerability that comes with age, even in the most apparently indestructible of people, and it moved those who were watching toward a particular tenderness. The concert on the 4th of June, on the forecourt of the palace, gathered the great names of British and international music under the shadow of the building that Victoria and Albert had made the symbolic center of a global empire. It was spectacular and joyous and thoroughly modern, a superimposition of the contemporary entertainment culture upon the oldest of British institutions, made possible by a woman who had the wisdom to understand that the institution's survival depended on its willingness to be, on occasions like this, genuinely alive to the world it inhabited. 2012 was also the year of the London Olympics themselves, and the particular genius of those games, which were widely judged to be among the most successful in the modern era, was the way in which they offered Britain an opportunity to present itself to the world, not as a country in decline, struggling with the aftermath of the financial crisis, but as a country of extraordinary cultural richness and self-deprecating wit and historical depth. The opening ceremony that Danny Boyle directed, the ceremony in which the Queen had played her part, managed the remarkable feat of being simultaneously proud and funny, which is perhaps the most authentically British combination available. The athletes performed. The crowds filled the venues. The medals accumulated. And through it all, visible at the opening, at the closing, at the key moments of the athletic program, was the figure of the Queen, 86 years old, seated in her characteristic posture of alert composure, watching everything with the focused attention of someone who does not permit herself the indulgence of inattention. The years between the Diamond Jubilee and the Sapphire Jubilee of 2017 were years of continued quiet accumulation, the daily work of the reign proceeding with its customary discipline while the world around it continued its own restless transformation. The political landscape of Britain was shifting in ways that would, in the latter part of the decade, produce the most significant constitutional upheaval since the war. But before the political storms arrived in their full force, there was a milestone. On the 9th of September 2015, Elizabeth became the longest reigning monarch in British history. She surpassed Queen Victoria on that date, surpassed the great-great-grandmother whose portrait hung in the rooms of the palaces she inhabited, whose reign had defined the empire she had inherited and then relinquished, whose very name had become synonymous with an era. Victoria had reigned for 63 years, 216 days. On the 9th of September 2015, Elizabeth passed that mark. She marked the day with characteristic restraint. She did not arrange a celebration. She had in fact attempted to ensure that the day passed without undue ceremony, because she had always been uncomfortable with milestones that drew attention to her own longevity at the expense of her continuing service. She said in the brief statement she permitted herself that the record was not something to which she had aspired, which was entirely true. She had simply continued. That continuation had eventually brought her to a place in history that no other British monarch had reached, and she acknowledged it with the same composure with which she acknowledged everything, which was to say directly, briefly, and then moving on. But the record was real, and its significance was not only quantitative. It was not merely that she had reigned longer than Victoria. It was what the length of the reign represented, the span of history it contained, the continuity it embodied, the sheer breadth of the experience it had accumulated. She had been present at events that no one else alive had witnessed from the same position. She had known people in the intimacy of the constitutional relationship who were now historical figures: Churchill, Eisenhower, de Gaulle, Kennedy, Nehru, Mandela. She carried in her memory a direct personal knowledge of the 20th century's great turning points that was possessed by no other living person. The political upheavals of the latter part of the decade arrived with the particular suddenness of events that have been building for a long time, but that still manage, when they finally break, to surprise. The referendum on British membership of the European Union, the Brexit referendum, as it was universally known by the shorthand that the era generated for its defining crisis, took place on the 23rd of June 2016. The result, 52% in favor of leaving, was received by those who had expected a different outcome with the stunned incomprehension of the genuinely surprised. The political consequences unfolded over the following years with the grinding, exhausting complexity of a constitutional and diplomatic challenge for which the country had made inadequate preparation. 3 prime ministers consumed by the process, 2 general elections, a prorogation of Parliament that the Supreme Court declared unlawful, and a negotiating process of extraordinary intricacy conducted against the deadline of European treaty obligations. Through all of it, the Queen said nothing. This was not, as some of her critics occasionally implied, the silence of indifference. It was the silence of constitutional discipline, maintained in conditions of extreme provocation, maintained because she understood with absolute clarity that the moment the sovereign expressed a view on a contested political question was the moment the monarchy became a player in the partisan conflict rather than its resolution. Brexit had divided the country in a way that few political questions in living memory had managed. Had divided families, communities, professions, institutions, creating fault lines of genuine hostility between people who had previously lived in comfortable agreement. The country needed more than ever something above the fault line. It needed the crown to be neutral. She was neutral, with whatever cost to herself that entailed, and she was a person of views, as her careful occasional hints over the decades had demonstrated. She was neutral, publicly and completely and without apparent effort. She continued her audiences with the successive prime ministers that the Brexit crisis generated. She read her papers. She asked her questions. She sat above the storm in the ancient peculiar elevation of a constitutional monarch who reigns but does not govern, and she maintained the height with the discipline of 65 years of practice. The political crisis was still unresolved, the country still deeply divided, when something arrived from outside the human world of politics and policy that rendered all of it simultaneously more urgent and less important. The coronavirus pandemic reached the United Kingdom in the early weeks of 2020, and by the middle of March, the government had imposed a lockdown of unprecedented scope, the closing of businesses and schools and churches and public spaces, the instruction to an entire population to remain at home, the enforcement of a physical separation between people that was both medically necessary and humanly devastating. She had been moved to Windsor Castle as the lockdown began, the palace's medical advisors judging it the safer location, more easily secured and more easily managed in terms of household size. She and Philip were there together, the two of them, in the vast and quiet rooms of the castle where she had spent her wartime childhood, where the corgis ran on the same grounds that she had walked as a girl, listening to the distant thunder of the Blitz. On the 5th of April 2020, she gave a televised address. It was only the fifth time in her reign, outside the annual Christmas broadcast, that she had spoken to the nation in this direct way, the previous occasions being the Gulf War, the death of Diana, the Golden Jubilee, and the immediate aftermath of the September 11th attacks. The threshold for such addresses was high, because their power depended on their rarity. The sovereign speaking directly to the people was an event, and its weight derived from its infrequency. She sat in a chair in the white drawing room at Windsor, dressed in green, a green that several commentators noted was the color of hope, though whether this was intentional symbolism or simply a choice of dress, no one could say with certainty, and the ambiguity was in itself characteristic. She spoke without notes, or appeared to. Her voice was steady, and her gaze was direct, and the room behind her was formal in the manner of Windsor state rooms, and she looked as she always looked, entirely and composedly herself. She spoke of the darkness that the pandemic represented, and of the response of the health workers, and the emergency services and the volunteers who were sustaining the national effort. She spoke to those who were grieving, and to those who were separated from the people they loved. She acknowledged that the days ahead would be hard. And then she said, "I hope in the years to come everyone will be able to take pride in how they responded to this challenge. And those who come after us will say that the Britons of this generation were as strong as any. That the attributes of self-discipline, of quiet good-humored resolve, and of fellow feeling still characterize this country." And she ended with the words of Vera Lynn's wartime song, the song that she had known since she was a child in the war, the song that belonged to the generation that had sat in the shelters and listened to the bombers overhead and believed, through the length of the worst years, that the light would come back. "We will meet again," she said. The effect was immediate and profound. The speech was watched and read and shared across the world, not only in the United Kingdom, but in every country that had a relationship with her and many that did not. It was shared because it said something that the moment required, and that very few other voices were able to say with equal authority. Something about endurance, about the possibility of coming through, about the example of people who had faced worse and survived. She was the only person alive who could invoke the wartime experience, not as historical metaphor but as personal memory, who could say "we will meet again" and be understood as someone who knew from the interior what those words had meant to the people who first sang them. She was 93 years old. She had been queen for 68 years. She had lived through the war and the empire's end, and the Cold War and the social revolution of the 60s, and the economic crises of the 70s and the Thatcher years, and the broken years and the new millennium and Brexit, and now this pandemic, this strange and terrible stillness that had descended on the world. And she sat in her chair in Windsor Castle, and spoke to her people with the same composure, the same directness, the same quality of unhurried authority that she had always had, that she had had since she was 14 years old, and stood before a microphone on the BBC's Children's Hour and spoke to the evacuated children of Britain about shared sacrifice and endurance. She had been for a long time the custodian of certain titles and honors, whose age and particularity spoke to the extraordinary depth of the institution she embodied. As sovereign of the Order of the Garter, the oldest order of chivalry in the world, founded by Edward III in 1348, its membership limited to 24 knights companion chosen by the sovereign personally. She was the head of a tradition that connected the present monarchy to the medieval world in which English kingship had found its essential forms. The ceremonies at Windsor, in which the knights processed in their blue velvet mantles and their plumed hats through the grounds of the castle she had known since childhood, were not performances of an invented heritage. They were the continuation of something genuinely ancient, and she presided over them with the seriousness of a woman who understood that antiquity, properly maintained, is one of the most powerful arguments available for the relevance of an institution in the present. The Platinum Jubilee of 2022 was the final great public celebration of her reign. 70 years, a number so large that it strained the imagination to contain it, that required for its proper comprehension some act of historical triangulation. 70 years ago, Churchill was Prime Minister. The Korean War was being fought. The Korean peninsula had barely recovered from its own devastation, let alone built the economy that would make it, by 2022, a global technological power. 70 years ago, India had been independent for 5 years, and most of Africa was still under colonial rule, and the European Union did not exist, and nor did the internet, nor the mobile telephone, nor the mapping of the human genome, nor the practical possibility of a human journey to the moon, which would not happen for another 17 years. She had been queen for all of it. She had been reading her papers and receiving her prime ministers and making her tours and delivering her Christmas broadcasts, while the world had remade itself, repeatedly and radically, around the fixed point of her presence. The Jubilee was celebrated over 4 days in early June of 2022. The trooping, the color, the Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's, the pageant, the concert. She appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace on the first day, in a pale blue coat, and the crowd below her in the Mall was enormous, and their response to her appearance was the response of people who had come a very long way, many of them to be in that particular place at that particular moment, and who felt, looking up at the small, upright figure on the balcony, that they were witnessing something they would want to have witnessed, that they were part of a moment whose significance they could feel even if they could not entirely articulate it. She was 96 years old. She waved. She looked out at the crowd with the steady, attentive gaze that had been hers since the beginning, the gaze that always appeared to be actually seeing the people it was directed toward, as though the thousands below were not a crowd but a series of individuals, each one noted, each one acknowledged, each one receiving their portion of the attention that she had been giving steadily and without interruption for 70 years. The wave. The balcony. The crowd. The long continuity of all of it, stretching back across 7 decades to the June morning in 1953 when the crown had descended and the trumpets had sounded, and a 26-year-old woman had sat very still in the ancient chair above the stone of destiny, and the world had begun. Chapter 10, The Eternal Farewell, Legacy of the Platinum Queen, 2021-2022. On the 9th of April 2021, in the early afternoon, Buckingham Palace announced that His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, had died peacefully that morning at Windsor Castle. He was 99 years old. He had been married to Elizabeth for 73 years, 4 months, and 14 days, the longest marriage in the history of the British monarchy, a union that had begun in the grey November of 1947, when 2 young people had said their vows in Westminster Abbey, and the bombed and rationed country had gathered around its wireless sets and allowed itself for one day to feel something uncomplicated. He had been with her for nearly everything. He had been there when she became queen, standing behind her on the aircraft steps at Heathrow in the cold February afternoon of 1952, the man in the background of the image that history preserved of her arrival, the man who had told her in a Kenyan forest that her father was dead and that the world had changed. He had been there through every decade that followed, through the coronation and the jubilees, and the Commonwealth tours and the state visits and the prime ministers and the crises, always slightly behind her, slightly to the side, occupying the particular position of a man of formidable intelligence and considerable will, who had subordinated both to the service of something larger than himself, which was her. The sacrifice that this required, the daily, lifelong subordination of his own considerable gifts to the support of another person's role, was not one that he made silently or without visible frustration at the constraints it imposed. He was too honest for that, too direct, too constitutionally unsuited to pretense. But he made it entirely and for the duration, and what it produced was the longest and most consequential act of service in the story of the modern British monarchy. She had described him, at their golden wedding anniversary in 1997, as her strength and stay. The phrase was taken from a hymn, and it was chosen with the careful precision of a woman who uses language economically and means what she says. Strength and stay. The thing that holds you up and the thing that keeps you in place, the support that is also the anchor, the presence without which the structure might, in the deep and private sense, be less certain of itself. She had known him for 83 years. She had loved him for nearly all of them. The funeral took place on the 17th of April, in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. The congregation was limited by the pandemic restrictions still in force at that point in the spring of 2021, to 30 people. 30 people in a chapel built to hold 800, the empty pews stretching away in the golden light of the afternoon, the absence of the crowd making its own enormous statement about the year that had passed and the losses it had accumulated. The coffin, placed on a specially modified Land Rover that Philip himself had helped to design, was carried through the grounds of Windsor Castle in a procession of simple, austere dignity. And she sat alone. The image of Elizabeth at Philip's funeral, seated in the choir of St. George's Chapel, in her black coat and her black mask, in a pew that was otherwise empty, the nearest mourner several feet away on the far side of the social distancing that the pandemic had made the grammar of public gathering, that image became one of the most powerful of the 21st century. Not because it was dramatic in the conventional sense, but because it was so precisely, so unmistakably, a portrait of what her life had been and what it required. Here was the woman who had been born to one of the grandest positions on earth, who had spent her life surrounded by the apparatus of ceremony and attendance and the constant managed presence of other people. And she sat in the chapel of the castle she had inhabited since childhood, at the funeral of the man she had loved since she was 13 years old, and she sat alone, because the rules said that people must sit alone, and the rules, even at this cost, even in this moment, applied. She did not make a gesture toward the other mourners that might have suggested she found the arrangement unreasonable. She did not turn her head to seek company across the social distance. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her back straight, in the posture that had been hers since she was a young woman, and she attended the service and received its words, and listened to the music and said goodbye to her husband of 73 years in the form that the occasion required and the law permitted. There was a photograph. A single photograph, taken from a distance, that showed her sitting in the pew in her black coat, the empty space around her, the chapel's vast interior making the smallness of the congregation visible in every dimension. The photograph circulated around the world within hours, and people who saw it felt something that went beyond the ordinary experience of seeing a public figure at a private moment. Something that recognized, in the image of that particular woman sitting in that particular space, a truth about what duty costs, and what love endures, and what a life given entirely to service looks like at the moment when the personal cost of it is greatest. The country, still living under the restrictions of the pandemic, was largely unable to gather to grieve with her. And perhaps that was fitting in its painful way. She had always, in the deepest sense, carried the weight of the sovereign's position alone. Philip had been there beside her and behind her, and sometimes, in the complicated way of a marriage between two very strong people, ahead of her. But the crown was hers alone. It had always been hers alone. She had always known that. She grieved. She grieved in the private manner of her particular character, not performing the grief, not inviting the world into it, but living it in the interior space where she had always lived the things that mattered most. Those who were around her in the weeks and months after Philip's death reported a woman diminished in a physical sense, as though a structural support had been removed, as though the body understood what the mind was managing. She was 94 years old, and the man who had been her constant for 73 years was gone, and she was diminished. But she continued. She continued in the only way she had ever known, which was to turn toward the work and find in it the discipline that had sustained her through every previous loss. The audiences continued. The red boxes continued. The engagements continued, adapted to the limitations of her mobility. She had been using a walking stick with increasing regularity in the preceding months, the visible sign of the physical slowing that comes to everyone who is fortunate enough to live long enough to experience it. She made her appearances from a seated position where previously she had stood. She conducted more engagements virtually, by video call, in the manner that the pandemic had normalized and that her reduced mobility made practically sensible. She had always been, beneath the formal exterior, a deeply practical person. She adapted to what was available without apparent regret for what was not, and she extracted from the available form the full measure of what it could provide, and she did this without drawing attention to the adaptation, because drawing attention to it would have made it about herself, and it was never in her understanding of the role about herself. The months passed. The Platinum Jubilee was celebrated in June of 2022. That final great occasion of public gathering, the balcony and the crowd and the wave. She had appeared. She had been seen. She had been, in the ancient and essential sense of the royal visibility, present. Those who saw her on the balcony of Buckingham Palace on that June afternoon, and who noticed the smallness she had acquired, the slight uncertainty of her movement, the way that age had reduced the physical frame without touching the quality of the attention in the eyes, those people understood without needing to be told that they were seeing something in its final chapter. She went to Balmoral in the late summer of 2022. Balmoral was where she had always gone, the place that had been hers since childhood, the Highland estate that Victoria had built and that every subsequent monarch had inherited, along with the particular attachment to the Scottish landscape that the place produces in those who spend time within it. She loved it with the love she had always had for the outdoors, for the wide sky and the heather-colored hills, and the sound of the Dee moving through the landscape below the castle. She was most entirely herself at Balmoral, in the way that people are most entirely themselves in the places where they are least required to perform. She had, in the final months of her reign, been performing one last constitutional duty. The political turbulence of the period had produced, in the summer of 2022, another change of Prime Minister, Boris Johnson's resignation in July, the Conservative Party leadership contest that followed, and the emergence of Liz Truss as the new leader. The convention required that the new Prime Minister travel to the sovereign to receive the formal appointment, the occasion of the kissing of hands, the moment in which the constitutional relationship between the Crown and the government is renewed in its ancient form. She had, for the previous two prime ministerial appointments, conducted this ceremony at Windsor. Her doctors had advised against unnecessary travel. But the convention existed, and the convention had its form, and the form required that it take place in the proper manner. She received Liz Truss at Balmoral on the 6th of September 2022, the appointment conducted in Scotland, in the castle she loved, in the particular Highland light of the early September afternoon. The photographs from that occasion showed her standing to receive her new Prime Minister, upright, formally dressed, the hands that had received so many Prime Ministers over 70 years extended in the customary greeting. She was visibly frail. She was also visibly and completely the Queen. It was the last public engagement of her reign. The 15th Prime Minister she had appointed in 70 years, from Churchill to Truss, 15 governments, 15 elections, the full arc of the post-war political history of the United Kingdom, all of it encompassed within the span of the constitutional relationship she had maintained without interruption from the 6th of February 1952. 2 days later, on the 8th of September 2022, at Balmoral Castle, Elizabeth II died. She died peacefully, her doctors reported in the afternoon. She was 96 years old. The family had gathered through the course of the day, Charles flying up from London, the others following, summoned by the communications of a household that understood, with the quiet efficiency of long preparation, what the day required. She was not alone. She died as she had lived, in the company of the family that she had sometimes struggled to protect and had always struggled to hold together, in the landscape that she loved best, in the last of the summer light over the Scottish hills. At 6:31 in the evening, the BBC interrupted its scheduled programming. The presenter appeared as the convention requires on such occasions, in black. A single sentence was delivered, in the form that such sentences have been delivered since the machinery of mass communication made possible the simultaneous address of an entire nation. The Queen had died. The words were spoken and were received across the country, in the particular silence that follows the announcement of something that has been expected, and that still, when it arrives, stops the breath. People went to the gates of the palaces. They went to Buckingham Palace and to Windsor, and they brought flowers, because the bringing of flowers is the gesture that the English make when the most important things happen. And they stood in the September evening and were quiet together, which is also an English thing, and they felt what they felt. The grief that is not only for the loss of a person but for the loss of a presence, the loss of something that has been so constant in the landscape of the days that its absence creates a topographical alteration, a place in the familiar view where something used to stand and no longer does. She had been queen for 70 years and 214 days. She had served under 15 prime ministers and met 14 presidents of the United States, from Harry Truman to Joe Biden. She had reigned through the Korean War and the Suez Crisis, and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War and the oil crisis, and the Troubles and the Falklands War and the Gulf War, and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the global financial crisis and the pandemic. She had seen the British Empire become the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth become the largest voluntary association of nations in the world. She had seen Britain join the European community and leave it. She had seen the Berlin Wall built and torn down. She had seen the first human being walk on the moon, and the first human genome sequenced, and the first social media post sent into the void of an internet that connected more minds more rapidly than any technology in the history of the species. She had seen all of it from the same position, the fixed point, the constant, the anchor of nations. The funeral took place on the 19th of September in Westminster Abbey, the same abbey where she had been crowned 69 years before, and where she had been married 74 years before. The procession from Westminster Hall, where she had lain in state for 4 days while the queues of mourners stretched for miles through the London streets, people waiting for 14 hours, 12 hours, 10 hours in the September warmth, simply to file past the coffin for a moment of proximity to something they felt they needed to be near. The procession carried the coffin through streets lined with an estimated 1 million people, in a silence that was observed across the ceremonial route with a unanimity and a discipline that those who were present found almost as moving as the occasion itself. She was buried at Windsor in the King George VI Memorial Chapel, beside her father and her mother and her sister. And beside Philip. Beside the man who had been her strength and stay. Beside him at last, after the 530 days of his absence that had been, by all available evidence, the longest days of her long life. She had said in her 21st birthday broadcast from Cape Town, in the green and flowering June of 1947, that she declared before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service. She had been 20 years old. She had been a young woman in the African spring, speaking into a microphone, making a promise that she perhaps could not entirely foresee the dimensions of, but that she made with complete sincerity, with the total and uncomplicated intention of someone who does not make promises she does not intend to keep. She kept it. For 70 years and 214 days, she kept it. She kept it in the red boxes and the weekly audiences, and the Commonwealth tours and the state visits, and the Christmas broadcasts, and the troopings of the colour and the openings of Parliament, and the diplomatic dinners, and the long accumulated unglamorous daily weight of constitutional service rendered without complaint and without interruption. She kept it in the years of personal grief, the death of her father, the death of her sister, the death of her mother, the death of her husband, the death of a daughter-in-law she had not always understood. She kept it in the years of institutional crisis, the broken marriages, the annus horribilis, the Diana years, the Brexit division, the pandemic isolation. She kept it in the years of triumph, the Jubilees, the Ireland visit, the Olympic film, the moments when the institution she embodied and the people she served found in each other, the warmth and the mutual recognition that make the whole extraordinary arrangement worth the effort. The legacy of Elizabeth II is not found in legislation passed or wars won or territory secured. She was a constitutional monarch. She did not make policy. She did not command armies. She did not write laws. What she did was something harder to define, and in the long measurement of historical consequence, perhaps more durable than any of those things. She held something together. Through the most turbulent century in human history, and through the turbulent opening years of the century that followed, she held something together. An institution, yes, but also an idea. The idea that there is value in continuity, in the long perspective, in the fixed point around which the movement of events can be measured. The idea that service, given entirely and without reservation, is its own form of power. The idea that a person can occupy the highest position available to them, and use it not for self-aggrandizement or personal advancement, but simply, solely, and completely for the good of the people they serve. She was called, in the languages of the people she served, by many names. The Rain Queen, the White Heron of Single Flight, Mother of all peoples, Mama Queen, Mrs. Queen. Each name in its own language said something about what she meant to the people who had given it, something that the formal titles of the constitutional documents could not contain, something felt rather than legislated, something personal rather than institutional. In the English language, at the end, she was simply the Queen. As though the word in its simplest form, unmodified and unqualified, had come to mean her, as though the concept and the person had become, across 70 years of continuous presence, effectively synonymous. To say the Queen was to say Elizabeth. To say Elizabeth was to say the Queen. The identification was complete. She had been born at 20 minutes to 3 in the morning, on the 21st of April, 1926, in a house in Mayfair, third in line to a throne she was not expected to occupy. She had died on the 8th of September, 2022, at Balmoral Castle, in the hills of Aberdeenshire, Queen of the United Kingdom, and of 14 other realms, head of the Commonwealth of 56 nations, the longest-serving British monarch in history, and the second longest-reigning sovereign of any nation-state in the recorded history of the world. Between those 2 points, between the Mayfair bedroom and the Highland Castle, between the accidental beginning and the completed end, lay a life of such sustained, such extraordinary, such unrepeatable dedication to the duty she had been given that the only adequate response to it in the end is the simplest one. She served for 70 years without interruption, without complaint, without visible diminishment of the commitment she had made at 21, on a South African morning in the middle of the last century. She served. And the world she served was, in the small and unmeasurable ways by which great institutions leave their mark on the people they shelter, better for it. The anchor held. On a September afternoon in 2022, the long continuity finally reached its end in the place Elizabeth loved best. She passed away at Balmoral, having appointed her 15th Prime Minister only 2 days prior, performing her constitutional duty until the very last of her strength was spent. She was buried at Windsor, returned at last to the side of the man she had called her strength and stay, closing a chapter of British history that had spanned nearly a century. Her legacy is not found in the exercise of political power, but in the enduring power of a promise kept. At 21, she pledged her whole life to service, and for 70 years and 214 days she never looked back. She remains the defining figure of her era, a sovereign who understood that to lead is to serve, and that the greatest strength lies in the quiet, good-humored resolve to simply remain. The anchor has been lifted, but the marks of its hold remain etched into the fabric of the modern world.